I'll go.
Welcome to this year's Responsible Raw Materials Annual Conference. It is quite astounding, but this is our 5th conference that we have put on for free and online for those of us who are really interested in different aspects of raw materials to come together and share our ideas. Now, as you can see on the screen in front of you, we've got a whole wonderful host of volunteers and some of our speakers for the first session for this afternoon. We're going to get them to introduce themselves shortly, but just while we wait for our final batch of attendees to come and join us here today, we are of course running this through a Zoom webinar. I suspect that most people are well and truly experts in this, but back when we started Responsible Raw Materials, which was in the depths of COVID in 2020, some people had never used Zoom before. Gosh, wasn't that exciting? So in case you are one of those lucky people who is new to Zoom or perhaps has been spending their lives in a different form of video conferencing, the buttons that you need, unless of course you are on a phone or a fancy tablet or something like that, are down at the bottom of the screen. If you're an attendee, you will have options such as Q&A. So please click on that and then a separate little box will appear. We greatly look forward to all of your questions and will endeavour to answer as many of them as possible during each of our sessions. We've also got things like the chat function. So please do feel free to click on the chat function and then a box will pop up over on the right hand side of the screen, and you should be able to message everybody again with your thoughts, with your ideas, with your questions. We're also, of course, streaming live to YouTube. And so for those of you that are there watching us on YouTube, please feel free to put your questions into the chat there. We will be keeping an eye on that. And then for anybody else who wants to just reach out on things like LinkedIn and other forms of social media, we will be monitoring those platforms as well, because this is all about trying to be or attempting to be as inclusive as possible and welcoming all perspectives, all ideas with regards to the topics that are being discussed here today. Now, we're keeping this as open as possible. However, those of you with beady eyes will have seen on our website, we do have a code of conduct, which basically just provides some ground rules, which sounds very scary. But basically, if anybody's naughty or if anybody's nasty, then we will start to revoke your privileges. Do I sound like a school headmistress? Perhaps that could have been an alternative career for me. But basically, with regards to this, we do have provisions in place. If we have a Zoom bomber or something super exciting like that, we will be moving to a different platform. So just to let you know that we do have plans in place with regards to that. If anybody has any other questions in terms of administrative stuff, then please just pop it into the chat wherever you might be, and we will do our best to come back to you. So with regards to who we have in this year's conference lineup for you, you will have seen our lineup on the website, but you might also be looking at the screens in front of you and thinking, hang on a second, there's somebody missing. And indeed, there is somebody missing from today's lineup, and that person is Dr. Rose Clark. Now, Rose and myself, we set up Responsible Raw Materials back in 2020, in part because Rose was doing an internship with the organisation that I run. And of course, COVID had put a slight spanner in the works in terms of what we were putting together. And so we thought, we'll put together a conference that's a little bit different. Now, Rose isn't with us today because she's had a baby. And so what we have been given permission by Rose to do is to dedicate today's session to the new little person that has come into this world. So Rose's little person, or I should say Rose and Tom's little person, this session is for you. And we're going to try and make it as special as possible. And I will try and remember to dedicate it to you again later. Yes, thank you very much to those of you who have found the reactions button. You can send as many congratulations as you like. So, of course, Rose's boots are a large pair of boots to fill. She's got quite small feet, to be honest. So I say that in line with the setting. And so instead of it just being Rose, Ludovine, and myself running today's conference, you can see we have a cast of thousands because there need to be so many of us to try and do what Rose has been up to. But I'm just going to go around our screen and get everybody to introduce themselves and say who they are, because a massive thank you to the big volunteer team that sits behind the scenes to make this conference happen. I'm going to start with Aileen because you're sitting there at the top of my list. We'll go to Aileen first. Do you want to say hello to everybody? And then we're going to go to Ludovine.
Yeah, hey everyone. Thanks for joining our fifth iteration of the Responsible Raw Materials Conference. My name's Aileen and I'm currently based over in Ireland. And my background's a bit more academia and economic geology, but with ties into responsible supply chain. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Aileen. Ludovine, do you want to say hello? And then we'll go to Miranda.
Thank you very much. Hello to everybody. Thank you for joining. I look forward to discussing all of these issues with you. My background is in governance and policy, and my current focus / obsession is what risk means to various parties and what they're actually doing about it. So that's what I'll be discussing. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ludovine. Miranda, do you want to say hello to everyone? And then we'll go to Sophia.
Hello, everyone. Greetings from Canada. My name is Miranda, and I'm just really excited to learn. We've got a great lineup of speakers this week, and I'm pretty keen to hear from everyone. So if anyone wants to join and hang out with me in the chat, I will be there.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Miranda. Sophia, do you want to say hello? And then we'll go to Vanessa.
Unmuted person. Hi, everyone. I'm Sophia. I'm pretty new to the team and new to the industry, but looking forward to learning a lot over the next week. I have sort of a passion about sustainability and social impact, so we'll definitely be picking up some ideas around that area.
Awesome. Thank you, Sophia. Vanessa, do you want to say hello? And then we will go to Matt.
Hello, I'm Vanessa. As Sarah said, I've been doing a lot of work behind the scenes to help bring this all together. It's been very exciting. My accent is from New Zealand, but I am based in the UK at the moment.
Fantastic. Thanks, Vanessa. Matt, do you want to say hello to everybody? And then I will briefly allow our speakers who have got up early in the morning or late in the afternoon, depending on where they are based, to say hello. But Matt, do you want to go first? And then we'll go to Andy.
Hi, I'm an exploration geologist by background. I have a PhD in gold exploration and then worked in technical consulting. And now I end up working with the lovely gang at Satala in the world of risk management and sustainability. So the talks this week really tick a lot of my interested boxes, and I'm looking forward to some really interesting discussions. So you'll see me popping up in various places. So yeah, thanks.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Matt. Andy, do you want to say hello to everybody? We're going to hear lots more from you later on, but if you'd like to say a quick hello now, and then we will go to Terry.
Yes, good morning, everybody. Andy Reynolds. I'm in Edmonton, Alberta, in Canada, where I think we're just going to escape the northern edge of the foot of snow that's heading for Calgary today. So it's great to be with you, and I almost feel like part of your team, and so that's part of the value of this for me. So it's great to be with you, and I'll be talking to you later on today.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Andy. Fantastic. Terry, do you want to say hello to everybody? And then we will go to Doris.
Hello, everyone. I'm Terry Gard. Spent most of my professional mining career in Zimbabwe, now living in the UK. Latterly specialized in artisanal mining, and look forward to talking to you all again later.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much, Terry. And Doris, do you want to say hello to everyone?
Thank you, Sarah. So delighted to be here. With 30 years of experience, half in operations and half as a consultant globally, and with PhD in metallurgy, I'm really passionate about sustainability, and we love to share and discuss and learn together. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Doris. And especially to Doris and to Andy, thank you so much for getting up so nice and early, testing your microphones, etc., before we began today. So brilliant. This year's conference is a really, really exciting lineup. I mean, every year is an exciting lineup. And we're going to start off this afternoon session with a little reminder of what Responsible Raw Materials has put together over the last few years since 2020. This, of course, being the 5th time that we've done one of these conferences, which is incredibly exciting. So what we're going to do in this session, which is session 1 of 8, is I'm going to start off by giving you a quick rundown as to where Responsible Raw Materials has come from and what we've managed to deliver on over the last few years. I'm then going to hand over to the one and only Ludovine, who you've just heard a little bit from, who's going to give us a bit of a scene setter in terms of, okay, what is this year's conference all about? What kinds of discussions and perhaps disagreements are we hoping to hear about, and what kind of ideas are we hoping to be inspired by? We're then going to be joined by the fantastic Stephen Desposito, who will be joining us from North America, followed by the lovely Doris, who you've already heard from already today. And then Terry is going to give us an insight into all things artisanal and small scale mining. And I was absolutely delighted to spend a bit of time with Terry earlier on this year and interviewed him as part of our critical productions outfit, where we managed to put together some videos. And I think, Terry, you managed to get some quite good feedback off that for some of the initiatives that you've got rolling at the moment. So it's a true delight to have you back with us today as well. We're then going to be joined by somebody who is, I mean, she can only be described as a legend because she wasn't supposed to be speaking in the conference until this morning. So unfortunately, Alicia is not feeling very well. So she has been struck down by the nasty COVID, but we're going to potentially try and slot her in later on in the week if she's feeling a little bit better. And instead, we're going to be joined by the fantastic Jodie Ann Wong, who is going to be sharing with us some of her thoughts with regards to financing a just transition in the extractive sector. So for those of you who have been going in and checking up on everybody's abstracts and you're thinking, hang on a second, I didn't know we were going to be hearing about that today. Well, Jodie Ann has managed to actually give us an abstract and a biography and everything else. So make sure you go into the website and find all of that. And then we're going to finish off today's session with the fantastic Andy Reynolds, who'll be sharing some of his thoughts with regards to how models rationalize resistance. For those panelists who are with us and are able to stick with it for the entire session, we're then going to finish with a bit of a panel session. But if you need to go, don't worry, that's fine, because we know that your time is precious. Now, all the way through today's session, we will be welcoming any chat that you've got, any questions that you've got, because of course, the Responsible Raw Materials Conference isn't just about today. No, we have many more sessions. And in fact, here is my printout for the week. So there are approximately 65 speakers that we have this week, all of whom will be sharing really quite different perspectives with regards to what are some of the different choices that we need to make with regards to raw materials, and what are some of the different models that we can explore with regards to how do we find them, how do we extract them from the ground, what kind of business models are there, what sort of economic models are there that allow us to ensure that we work with our raw materials in the most responsible way possible, but also we manage to unleash their potential fast enough so that we can ensure that energy transition that needs to occur in the most responsible way as well. So I won't steal any of Ludovine's thunder. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to go straight to the Responsible Raw Materials website. We've shared the link to that in the chat with all of you just now. So here is the website, and the tab that you need, of course, is here, 2024 conference, and you can see our lovely little infographic that we've put together for today, which is brilliant. We're not going to dive into the detail of it yet, but this is just to spark ideas and to say, okay, so what sorts of different choices do we have when we're thinking about raw materials, and what sort of information do we often need when we're trying to make all of these different choices. Down at the bottom of this page, of course, this is where we can find the agenda, be it for today, Tuesday morning, Tuesday afternoon, Wednesday morning. Yep, you get it all the way through until Friday morning. We can take bets now as to whether I will still have a voice left by Friday morning. Let's hope I do. But we've got a huge, fantastic array of people lined up to speak to us this week. But of course, responsible raw materials started a number of years ago. And if I go into our past events, you can find a load of the details from our 2020 conference. So let's just take a step back and think about, okay, where were we in May 2020? The world was a slightly different place back then. We had one or two things that we were all trying to deal with. And those of you who can remember maybe dialing into that conference will remember we had things like drawing competitions during the conference, and they were not only designed so that we could see what some of you thought a mine actually was, but so that we could also entertain children, for example, that might be dialing into the conference at the same time as yourselves. You can find, by clicking on all of these little buttons here, some blogs or some reminders as to what we talked about back in 2020, where the theme of the conference was just responsible raw materials. It was going to be a one-off. But if I then scale down here, you can see here are all of the fantastic speakers who came and joined us for that week of delightful knowledge sharing and discussion. It was absolutely fantastic. And when we got to the end of the week, the pool was such that everybody decided, hang on, I think we should do another one of these. And of course, that then takes us through, apologies if anybody's feeling sick with me scrolling up and down on the screen here. That then took us through to the 2021 conference. So in 2020, we'd come to the conclusion that actually sourcing and providing and looking after all our raw materials in a responsible way was important. But in 2021, we thought, okay, but how do we actually do it? What are the different tools, tips, tricks, and techniques we can use if we want to truly understand how do we make responsible raw materials a reality? And that is what gave rise to our conference in 2021, which was called the ESG Toolbox. And this little infographic that we put together here with a whole host of different ideas, of course, supported by another week of fabulous talks and interviews and ideas. This really got us going in terms of, okay, this isn't just a theory or a nice vision. This is something that we can really do. And actually, there's a whole host of people across the world that are doing different bits of this successfully already. So that was the premise behind the ESG Toolbox Conference, which took place in 2021. I should also mention that it was at this point in time as well. So earlier on in 2021, we put together something called the ESG Reporting Roundtable, which actually is in the depths of geology. So as a geologist myself, so I haven't actually introduced myself yet either. My name is Dr. Sarah Gordon, and I like rocks, but I also like sustainability. And I really enjoy hearing different people's perspectives with regards to raw materials. And it's because of this that back in 2021 and before that, we put together a roundtable session in January, and we pulled together lots of different individuals from across the world of geological mineral reporting. So when we're trying to understand what might be in the ground, what different data sets and criteria do we need to pull together so that we can promise to someone, yeah, this is what we think might be in the ground beneath our feet. So we also put together this conference here, which was just a day long, that involved people talking to us from everywhere from Australia to Canada, China, Indonesia, Mongolia, South Africa, Europe, the US, you name it. we spoke to them and we said, okay, what are you doing with regards to these areas? And the really awesome thing is that a lot of these conversations that weren't just held during this particular session back in 2021, there were lots of other conversations going on at the same time, but a lot of the ideas that people were discussing back in 2021 are now incorporated into these reporting codes. So what that means is that the world of sustainability is well and truly being drawn into how we share what kind of rocks we think might be in the ground beneath our feet. So that's pretty awesome. And that in part came out of some of the work that we did back in 2021. Moving forwards to 2022, and the conference in 2022 was focused on the just energy transition. And what we asked ourselves was, what on earth does that mean? Because if you go and ask somebody who works in a different sector or a different country, the concept of a just transition can mean very different things to very different people. And the hypothesis that we were posing here was, can mining as an industry act as a mechanism through which we can unlock the full potential of a just energy transition? Or are we just totally mad, thinking that that might actually be a real possibility? And that is a case here where you can see again another full-blown conference that we put together during those weeks of May in 2022, where we really explored many of those different aspects of a just energy transition and the role of raw materials within that. Now, I personally spent all of last week in Geneva at the United Nations, and to be honest, a lot of the conversation that was had there, I felt very enhanced by this particular conference that we had been lucky enough to host all those years ago, because a lot of the discussions that were had back in 2022 are beginning to actually come to fruition now in 2024, which is really exciting. Rolling forwards to 2023, and what did we talk about last year? Well, last year, we spoke about trust. Now, I know that Andy Reynolds has got a lot to say on the concept of trust, and I'll bring in Andy in a second to share his thoughts on responsible raw materials as a whole. But last year, we explored the fact that within material value chains, i.e. raw material value chains, the need for trust, be it between different stakeholders or be it between different component parts in this system, is absolutely vital. And so that conference last year, again, included a whole host of speakers from across the world sharing what they felt was actually meant by trust. And we explored this, be it from everything from an academic level through to how it was manifesting on the ground in different parts of the world. And again, this has set us up really, really well, because anybody who's been working in the raw materials space over the last 12 months will probably have sat through a panel session where that concept of trust was used. And so this discussion that we had a year ago was great, because it was one of the first conferences actually where trust was that core theme that was used throughout the entirety of the discussion. So those are some of our key past events. Just in case some of you haven't been to the website before, feel free to explore things like who we are, but then also things like our learning materials as well. And you'll be able to go and explore various different interesting reports or teaching materials. These are not things that we've put together. We are purely acting as a conduit through which you can go and explore other people's material. If you have material that you would like us to share through our website, we'd be delighted to do so. So please just put it into the chat or send it through to us in our email. You could find that in the Contact Us button at the bottom of the website screens. So feel free to share all of that with us as well. And we'd be delighted to act as a conduit for yourselves so that other people can make use of your materials. We, of course, have the talks area here, and this is where you can get access to hundreds of different talks from the last few years. Now, you can either start at the top and work your way through a little bit like a box set that you might want to binge on your favorite streaming platform. I say that with a wry smile. That probably won't be the most exciting way of doing it, to be honest. Instead, what you can also do is click on one of these buttons here, for example, so mine planning. And within that, we've got an array of different talks that have something to do with mine planning, for example, that have been curated for you. Alternatively, what you can do is up here at the top right-hand corner of your screen, click on the little magnifying glass. And then here, I'm going to type in Ludovine, because I suspect, oh yes, Ludovine, let's go and see. There we have it. Okay, so what we have here is we have the talks that Ludovine has been very gracious to give to us over the last few years, which has been great. But also as well, what you have here is a link straight to Ludovine's talk that she is about to give very, very shortly. So if you want to know who Ludovine is, well, here is her biography, so feel free to go and check that out. And also her abstract for her talk can be found here as well. So you can explore everybody's talks by going into that talks page, okay, or going into the little magnifying glass and typing in the name of the person that you are looking for as a whole. So coming back to the 2024 conference, and I'm going to scroll just down to here where we talk about, okay, what does responsible raw materials actually do? So as you can see, we are that convener and facilitator of open dialogue. So what we're trying to do through our conference every year is bring as many different voices to the table as possible. We're not saying that anybody is right or is wrong. We just want to hear everybody's perceptions, so then we can each of us personally walk away from these sessions and make up our own mind with regards to, okay, what needs to be done next with regards to raw materials. We also share all of this knowledge where possible, and I've just shown you some of that array or that library of materials that we put together over the last few years. And of course, we attempt to be that independent and neutral voice with regards to raw materials. So trying to, through the curation and the collection of as many different voices as possible, say, okay, what does the world of raw materials actually mean? Now, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and instead I'd like to actually welcome Andy to the stage, because Andy, we met through the Responsible Raw Materials Conference a few years ago. You have been amazing, and you've come back to give us another talk later on today. But I wondered if you wanted to give us any of your thoughts with regards to what Responsible Raw Materials is all about and what we actually deliver.
Yeah, try and keep me away. Like, this is highlight of the calendar. Yeah, a couple of years ago, I was reading Green Swans, a great book by John Elkington. And I had a bit of an epiphany when he talked about people in the system change sector. And I suddenly thought, aha, that's the sector I'm in. And there is no event that gets me closer to the rest of that sector than this one. The reason I keep coming back to this is because it's so valuable to have this community of people who come together. This is the one conference. Most conferences you go to, the expectation is that you're going to show up and say, I know the answer to this. This is the one place where you can show up and say, I don't know the answer to this. And you have a track record of being ahead of the curve and enabling people like me who want to learn to come and immerse ourselves in a community of people who have perspectives to share and pieces of the puzzle. So I really salute what you and Rose and Ludovine and everybody else have achieved. And it's a privilege to be able to come along and take part in it again.
Well, brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Andy. And I promise everybody, I didn't ask him to say such nice words. But no, that's absolutely awesome. And it means a lot to all of us. We are, of course, we're a voluntary organization. We're a not-for-profit. The Zoom license, yes, is picked up by the consultancy that many of us work for. But the reason why we do this is because we passionately believe that raw materials are incredibly important for all of us, and where we do need to extract them from the ground or keep them in circulation, it needs to be done in the best way possible to derive as much value for as many people as possible, and this can certainly be done. So thank you very much for that, Andy. Fantastic. Now, as Andy has said, this is a conference where we really revel in people going, hang on a second, I don't know what the answer is, but these are some of my thoughts, and this is where I'm at the moment. And I will probably change what I'm thinking as those thoughts are coming out of my mouth. That is quite all right. And especially for those of you who are attending today, as I previously mentioned, please do feel free to engage with us in the chat. The chat can be commenting on the beauty of the flags that are sitting behind Matt at the moment. So thank you very much to Chris for noticing all of that. They can be commenting on anything from that through to the content of what we're talking about. Also, as well, please do use the Q&A, or if you're watching us on YouTube, use the chat that was within that as well, and we'll be able to deal with all of that too. So today's session, and of course we only have one session today because tomorrow's session starts at 8 a.m. UK time, and that is nice and early so that all of our wonderful friends in the likes of New Zealand and Australia and over there in exciting parts of Asia can dial in, and it's not the middle of the night for them. That will be a slightly different session that we'll be starting with tomorrow. But today, of course, we're kicking off this year's conference, and I'm going to welcome to the stage with us. I'm going to welcome to the stage. And let me just try and hit the record button again. Here we go. We're going to welcome to the stage the wonderful, the one and only Ludovine Wouters. So Ludovine, if you have any slides to share, now is a good moment to do it. She's saying, no, Sarah, I'm just going to speak to you. But what we will do, Ludovine, is we will spotlight you for everybody. There we go. We've made you nice and large. Ludovine, I'm going to hand it over to yourself to introduce yourself, but also explain to everybody why we chose this topic for this year's conference and what it's all about. Everybody, put your hands together for Ludovine. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. Hello again to everybody, and thank you for joining this conversation. I am going to demonstrate Andy's point in that I come mostly with questions, and a large part of this week is about getting as many perspectives to this conversation as possible, because I'm looking for some answers. And as Sarah pointed out, we've been building on some different topics, looking at mining and mineral operation sort of from the inside, and then how does all of that world connect to a whole universe of stakeholders, and how do we build trust, but also how does that trust feature in redesigning various systems? And all of that kind of led us this year to thinking, okay, well, there's a lot of words being thrown around that mean very specific things to very specific groups. De-risking is one that's high on the agenda. It's a big part of my work at the moment because I do a lot of work with policy shapers. And when you work with risk management consultants, you become a little sensitive to how that word is used, particularly when it's misused. And I think what I was hoping to put on the table for our conversation today is, behind all this talk of de-risking, what's actually meant or intended? Is it actually happening? And more importantly, what does it actually mean for mining and mineral operations worldwide? And how we can, as is the stated intent of everybody, who's sharing this conversation, improve responsibility. So I sort of wanted to start by just putting this word de-risking on the table. We've all heard a lot of the policy talk, de-risking coming out of the US as a sort of follow-on from the word decoupling. The basic idea hinges on, first of all, some user markets of minerals redesigning their supply chains in a way that their industry is less at risk from concentration, which also means redesigning some of their relationships with other countries or other states or other regions to expand the choice of providers. So that's a big sort of policy meaning. But the fact is, the word de-risking actually comes from investment. It actually comes from a lot of the mechanics that we've seen, not just in investment, but also in, banking, in a lot of the project management, operations management that we've all been, focused on for years. So I thought the first thing we could look at is, of all the policy statements about this de-risking of mineral value chains, i.e. creating more diversity in mineral value chains and more options for some buyer markets, are we anywhere near achieving those objectives? And frankly, it kind of seems that not only we're not nearer, but we're perhaps even moving backwards. So I can share the link in the chat of a report from the Bank for International Settlements. Bank for International Settlements is basically a bank for central banks. It's a cooperation platform where not only do they exchange data, but they determine, joint initiatives for monetary and financial stability. So these are like serious people, okay? These good people at BIS put out a report, I think last October or November. No, sorry, it was earlier this year, because it compares the state of global value chains, not specific to minerals, but value chains in general, in between December 2021 and September 2023. So these are 2 years where the narrative on value chains, on de-risking, has been, constant. And yet what they show is that value chains have not necessarily diversified, but they've lengthened. So instead of more direct cross-border reliance, we have more and more buyers in some markets, they specifically highlight the US, who remain connected to producers in the original markets of either production of raw materials or processing, but simply with more intermediate levels. So what's happening is that there's a response to the de-risking narrative, but we're not actually creating new sources or new nodes of production of the goods in these global value chains. If we apply that to mining and minerals, it's quite a stark picture, because what it effectively means is that we are not at all achieving the objective of reducing reliance on some countries. Let's be honest, the elephant in the room is China. Everybody talks about the Chinese risk. We're not decreasing reliance, but at the same time, we are adding intermediate levels between China and some of its end consumers. This is not exactly the narrative of creating new opportunities. This doesn't fit the narrative of criticality, magically creating new markets for these minerals. So if we think about what that means in terms of other uses of the word de-risking, then fundamentally we arrive at the meaning that we use for investment purposes. And it's very clear that there is a huge reticence to invest in mining and minerals. First of all, it's a small investment universe. Second of all, let's be honest, the last super cycle did not make us investors' darlings. So we are currently under scrutiny. And investors are very clear when they say, no, we want mining to apply stringent capital discipline. Do not waste our money the way you did in the last super cycle. And then there were write-offs in the billions. This is not exactly conducive to growth in an industry where we actually need risk capital just to live. Exploration is fundamentally the epitome of risk capital. We're not spending on exploration. The market wobbles of the last 6-9 months have demonstrated that criticality does not make a market, and it certainly does not make a super cycle. So where are we going with all of this? One of the options that a lot of the policy shapers who are talking about this de-risking in the wider sense, one of the options that they're pursuing is applying public capital to sort of shore up or unlock private sector capital. And there's lots of different approaches. Some are sort of direct checkbook, so US incentives under the Inflation Reduction Act, expanding worldwide via a network of free trade agreements. Okay. There are other checkbook approaches which actually don't even refer to state agreements. Saudi Arabia created a state-owned vehicle to which it then added some private investors who have their own sort of credentials in terms of why they're present in the game. But the ultimate aim is very clear and stated openly. This is to source feed for an emerging Saudi processing capacity. So all of these different approaches are shifting the dial somewhat, but they're definitely not changing the game. So one of my key problems is how do we look at this sort of big picture in a context where the very industry we're talking about is itself undergoing massive transformation. The way we explore, the way we mine, the way we process, the linkages between these operations, even if they're not shifting as quickly as we'd like, because we haven't redesigned value chains in the last 3 to 4 years, the fact is they will have to evolve. There is no doubt about that. If only because planetary boundaries are not negotiable. I'm a lawyer, recovering lawyer, so as you know, 2 and 2 can make 5. It's all a question of what we agree. But the thing is, you can't negotiate with nature any more than we already have. So at this point, we've got a mining and mineral sector that is underfunded to deliver to huge expectations, but also facing its own internal transition. You know, we've been talking about the skills issue in mining and minerals for 10 years. It's no longer a risk. It's here. It's here. The generation of operational middle management that we would need to actually be able to develop some of the new operations, if we could fund them, that generation doesn't exist because they weren't in the market before and after the super cycle. So as we're sort of, you know, having these gears that connect with difficulty, I think one of the key points that I was hoping to address throughout this week is what are we doing individually and collectively to not only achieve these investment objectives, these geostrategic goals of de-risking, but are we actually thinking about what they entail more widely? One of the, you know, inconsistencies is we keep talking about increasing processing capacity as a key element of de-risking. The last time we massively increased processing capacity, everyone in the world got their gold refinery. That led to the biggest gold rush in history and the emergence of illegal gold mining and all of its, you know, links to organized crime, terrorism, and state destabilization. So I think one of the key elements that I'm looking for across this whole conversation this week is how do we stand by the statements of improving and increasing responsibility? How do we also convey to the wider world that there is no resilience without responsibility, but that responsibility also entails working together rather than having, you know, these set slogans, whether you're pro or anti-mining, frankly, who cares? The fact is we need to do this and we need to do it well. It's not a question of which one takes precedence. It's a question of how we arbitrage competing priorities and competing interests. So long story short, I don't quite know, but I think these are the questions of the time, and I look forward to some of your answers.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ludovine. Absolutely amazing as always. Everybody, please put your hands together for the fabulous Ludovine Wouters. Excellent.
Thank you very much.
Now, Ludovine, we have got a few minutes before we need to go to our next speaker. And I know that there are a number of questions and comments that have been coming in the chat here in Zoom, but also as well through some of our other channels. Now, Ludovine, you mentioned that in terms of responsibility, but then also that resilience throughout our value chains, it requires all of us to come together. Now, with this, if we go and look at, say, those industries that make use of a lot of our raw materials, there are a huge number of different standards or requirements on, say, responsible sourcing, etc. So it's almost the fingers are pointing up the value chain towards the mining companies. Do you feel that actually that partnership that's needed between those primary raw material producers and then the industries that actually make use of the raw materials, do you think that's balanced enough, or do you think it is weighted one way or the other? What do you reckon?
Nice question. I think everybody has their own answer on this, but I see two things. The first one is there are competing models in terms of how to do this efficiently. And let's be honest, the vertically integrated model that comes from having a state-led economy, yes, I'm talking about China, has created huge efficiency, has empowered this Chinese industry to be wholly reliant on a very efficient value chain where, because it's very integrated, different levels can afford to take a hit on profitability, on positioning. But the thing is that there's no such state control in value chains that end in market economies, because that's just not how we've operated, and particularly in minerals, because these value chains are so diverse. I mean, you know, a few years ago, remember, everybody had ESG expert on their card. Today, it's critical minerals expert. What does that mean? I mean, if you understand one of these value chains, you are a champion. You know, the EU defined 35 critical minerals. The US is 50. Nobody's an expert in all of these. So I think the difficulty is that we're looking at a lot of different value chains with very limited capacity for the traditional integration model. And what that means is that when we're looking at all these different levels, living in silos with their profitability drivers, with their investment pools completely separate, everybody's going to try to limit their accountability because they think that's the best way to increase their profitability, reduce their risk and exposure. But the reality is it doesn't really work. So we've got a huge push for responsibility all the way upstream, and I don't dispute that. I think mining has a lot of catch up, you know, to do, and must be accountable for what it does well and what it doesn't do well. But the reality is, come on, mining is the guy who's panning for gold in a river all the way up to the mega pit. Like, the diversity we're talking about in this situation is spectacular. And frankly, even if every single one of those actors can produce the mineral in the most responsible way on earth, we lose track of it in processing. Like, who are we kidding? Processing is dirty, energy intensive, opaque, the source of market opacity, which currently heightens and frankly maintains criticality. So at this stage, I'm saying, yes, we can't have integrated value chains. So we don't have the protection of that, and we still have to deal with responsibility. But we need a much more integrated thought process in terms of industrial policy. And even if we had much more visibility on processing and those linkages, if we're producing all those minerals perfectly, very responsibly, I'm sorry, I'm going to steal from one of my favorite people, Paul Ekins. If it's to produce a 2-ton SUV that's driven around London, then we have failed, because that's a poor use of these resources. So responsibility is different for every actor. The more we look at the linkages, the more we hold each other accountable. I'm fine being a responsible miner, I want industry to treat this product with the respect that it deserves.
Awesome. Thanks, Ludovine. Now, Andy, you have politely put your hand up. Do you want to ask your question? And Ludovine, you have approximately 90 seconds before we're going to go to our next speaker. So, Andy, go.
I will be quick.
It won't be an easy question, but it is, what might we learn from the Second World War, which is arguably the last time that market economies had to change the goals of raw material value chains?
Super interesting. I do not have any answer, but I love it because what came out of World War II is the global governance institutions that we rely on today. If we want to talk about shifting models, we need to talk about shifting governance models. So I'm going to think about that and let's discuss it in the panel. But I agree with you. When the market shifts, the whole policy landscape that responds to this market, houses it and protects it, shifts as well. I think the first part of a response to that is we probably need to rethink our rights and obligations on natural resources. Maybe let's talk about the 1962 UN resolution that defines sovereignty over mineral resources. And no, I'm not saying that in a neo-colonialist way. I'm saying we've come to a situation where the stakes are global and existential. Probably we need to put everything on the table.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Ludovine, and great question there, Andy. Now, Ludovine, you've got a number of other questions that are beginning to filter in on the chat as well. So I will leave you to that. And instead, what I'm going to do is I will welcome to the stage our next fantastic speaker who we have with us, who is Stephen Desposito. So, Steve, I don't know if you want to share slides. Now is your moment to click those buttons. If not, we're just going to hear from you, which will be glorious. But what I will do is I will spotlight you for everybody. I will let Stephen introduce himself because he's going to share with us a fabulous story / case study of where we can get some of these changes that Ludovine was alluding to begin to happen. So everybody, please put your hands together for the fantastic Stephen. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. It's nice to get receive applause before you start. Maybe I'll stop here. Mic drop. Nice to be with you. I'm going to talk a little bit about an opportunity, an industry opportunity, and some challenges. I think we have some chance to do something that helps people, helps communities see the industry a little bit differently, but it's a space filled with challenges. When I go to communities where mining has taken place historically, typically, and especially when there's new mining being proposed, one of the first questions that you get, or the first questions that a new company gets, a new proponent gets, is, what are you going to do about the impacts of the past? How are you going to remedy that tailings, that leaching into water, even just the physical and visual disruption that resulted from past mining? And we all understand that it's not the responsibility of the legal responsibility or the corporate responsibility of the new mine proponent to fix all that, but I do think it's the industry's responsibility to take that into account, because we all know that, and we've been talking about critical minerals. It's pretty clear that we're going to need to accelerate the pace of development and production of critical minerals significantly. I would argue that the only way that's going to happen is if we can increase and accelerate community social license, both locally in communities where mining happens and globally with influencers and stakeholders and decision makers. Those two things have to happen. You have to get a reset of the industry's positioning around who it is and what it's trying to achieve. And the only way you're going to do that is if you can address the problems of the past. So it's a bit of a conundrum, really. And so what we've tried to do, I've launched a company. I've spent, by way of introduction now, after telling you what I'm going to talk about, by way of introduction, I run a startup mining company, which is called Regeneration. It's actually a restoration company that remines to support restoration and a different kind of closure outcome. And I've spent my career in environmental policy and advocacy, including designing public pressure campaigns to put pressure on the industry to do better. Going back to the late 1990s and early 2000s, when I was working with jewelry industry leadership and then technology companies, essentially using their brand value to put pressure up the supply chain, and introducing them for the first time to concepts like free, prior, and informed consent in their value chains. So that's where I come from, and so in some ways the unlikely CEO of a mining company, and I'm not trained in the technology or in geology or anything like that. I'm more trained in the intersection between industry and communities. And that's why I'm sitting in Washington, D.C., which is where my office is. So that's who I am, and that's what I'm working on. And so what are we doing, and why is this something that people in the industry, not just our company, should care about? I think it's because the industry needs us. Like so what we are is we're looking, waste is our opportunity, right? So all the tailings, waste rock, wastewater that comes out of old mines is an opportunity. And we know that in the mining space there's competition, but we see it so far as mostly purely commercial. Can the copper or the other metals in that tailings be turned into something that is a commercially viable project? And that's an important question to ask, because to the extent that's the case, then there's real good opportunity to rethink and repurpose that waste. But I think it's a mistake in the industry's part to just think commercially about mineral processing. We've got to think about the conditions in the communities and a different vision for closure, whether the tailings is purely commercial or it isn't. Our company, Regeneration, is a bit of an innovation in and of itself, because we set it up as a public benefit company, and we did that intentionally because our view is that there's great opportunity in the waste space, but there's also a lot of risk, and there's a lot of obstacles that are prohibitive. And the very first is that for good reasons, we treat anything that's a waste product as a liability if it has metals in it, if it has the potential for environmental impact. And that makes it very difficult to go put your hands back on it. And that's really typically for real good reasons, because it's hazardous. And so, the environmental laws that treat it as such are pretty smart, and then they're not as much, because if you think about the equation of greenfields mined opportunities, some of which are in highly significant habitat or areas of significant biodiversity, or even in regions where intact carbon would be disrupted by significant industrial development, you've got to take in the global math of climate and biodiversity, you've got to take all that into account. And so why not go back to the brownfield sites and rethink them? But you have to get past this issue of liability. We're not saying, one of the innovations we need to do that isn't to say, okay, there shouldn't be any liability. It's more about how do you enter that space responsibly, and how do we innovate in policy and regulation, which can be an oxymoron often. So that's one of the things. So one of the reasons we've set up as a public benefit company, and we think we're kind of an innovation on behalf of the industry, frankly, and its communities, is that we need to be willing to do things that aren't purely commercial in nature. I would be happy to go target a legacy. In fact, I'm working on a project right now where the First Nation wants this tailings addressed. It's almost an orphan site. It's not quite an orphan site. And it needs to be addressed. The problem is I'm not sure it's going to actually pay out commercially. So that in a lot of cases, the industry, as it's currently structured, would walk away from that project. I think the industry should walk toward that project. We should find ways to think differently. What about the nature value? What about the community value? How do we put that into the equation? Where can government come in and be a partner? Where can green finance come in and be a partner? And so if you're willing to take a little more time and a little more effort, you can do a project that's actually high value for conservation in communities and for the industry's social license. But if it was just a pure commercial calculation, you wouldn't do the project, right? So there's these stranded opportunities, and they're biodiversity, habitat opportunities, they're nature opportunities, and they're people and community opportunities, and therefore they're industry opportunities. It's as if we need a social enterprise, public benefit company on behalf of the industry to go after these sites. Oh, by the way, we're there. So it's really, Sarah told me not to make a pitch, and I'm not making a pitch for my company. I'm making a pitch that the industry needs this kind of stuff. And it's a mistake not to treat it as more than just a commercial partnership. We're pretty pleased that we have commercial and social environmental partners from the industry, from downstream, from communities. Like, that's all good. But I think that our plea is we need to do more and do it faster and better. And that, I think, will open up a lot of space. I'll just say one closing thing and I'll open it up because I don't want to just talk all, well, my morning, but that is, there are a few reasons now is the time for this, right? So one is and you've been talking about the critical minerals demand, and even though it's like temperamental, the long-term trend is certainly there, right? And so we need to get more of this stuff out of the ground. In our case, out of waste on the ground. It's a circular economy strategy. Like, we're just not post-consumer. It's not taking an iPhone and getting the metals out. It's the stuff that didn't make it into the iPhone is a pre-consumer circularity target. It's the decade of restoration, so we should be doing more restoration, and why not go to brownfields mine sites and turn them green? I mean, that's a global priority. And then fundamentally, this point I started with, social license, the industry needs it. If it wants to be, part of, and it wants to get through this tension in the system around scaling production, I think you need strategies like this. And I'm not saying we're the only one, but I think it's this kind of thinking that needs to be at the forefront of industry. It's trade associations, it's companies, it's sustainability departments, it's CSR departments, and so on. Thanks. I'll leave it at that, Sarah.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Steve. Everybody, please put your hands together for the fantastic Stephen Desposito. Thank you very much. Fantastic. Now, Stephen, I have been receiving all sorts of messages whilst you've been speaking, with people going, oh, this is so exciting, and various different comments and various different questions. One of the things that you were mentioning was, okay, so you've got your, say, normal model, which is where a company needs to try and find that financial value in what they're doing, and then this different model that you're following at the moment. Do you think that there needs to almost be a place for a whole diversity of different types of mining companies, some of which are very much following the financial basis, some of which are being more public benefit companies, etc.? So actually, rather than, I mean, obviously we can all come to yourselves, but actually having a whole marketplace of organizations that are doing things in a similar way to yourself. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would benefit the industry to have a little more of that kind of diversity in model, if you will. And I would maybe extend it a little bit. So, like, I just want to also be clear. I'm all in for a commercial project that we do that pays the bills and keeps the light on. I don't want to sound a little, too altruistic here. Like, we have to make it work, right? And we can prove to the industry that it can work by doing things, so having some commercial showcases and some social, non-commercial showcases. I think we have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. So I just want to put that caveat in. But I think the thing we should think about is that I think innovators in the space are having a difficult time. It's a very difficult industry to put something new into, right? And it's because the industry is conservative. Despite its talk about innovation, it's a conservative industry. And if in startup culture, in NGO culture, which is where I come from, you succeed by proposing new ideas that you can that rally people to solutions and that you can achieve, but they're new ideas. They're not the same old thing, right? Almost by nature, mining companies want to know that it's been done before. And so it's a block. As you, even some of our partners, as you work with them, their CEO may endorse what we're doing, but you get into the system and there are blocking mechanisms every step of the way.
So with that, sorry.
It's just that, so there's that, but then there's also like, we also need to think not just about mining. Like I was in a community recently and we were talking about partnering, and they said, well, actually, we'd rather partner on the restoration part. Like we want a restoration economy in our community, right? And so Regeneration is part of that, but they were like, you guys deal with the mining and help us with the restoration, but we want the restoration side. So I think that's like a way to maybe think a little, you have to think a little differently.
Awesome. So with that, Stephen, I feel like I'm being hit around the side of the head with somebody at the moment because they're going, it's not the mining companies that are conservative, it's the mining investors.
I think it's both. It's both. Well, I can tell you, like, I don't think, my view is this, the mining leadership and the many people in the industry are innovative in their thinking. I think the way mining happens and is planned and all the dimensionality of it is conservative by definition largely. And there's just like waste is a liability, there's good reasons for that. I'm not saying throw the baby out with the bathwater, but you know, the system works against innovation, plain and simple, in my humble opinion.
Thank you for that. We've got a question that's come in from Ryan in the chat, and Ryan says that they love the point that we need to see acceleration of social license. Have you seen examples of where that ability to accelerate is really working, but also where are some of the worst frictions?
I think the worst friction occurs in places where, so if you think about communities who are the receiving entities for all this stuff, meaning development, and they want it often, it's complicated now because you've got 30 by 30 nature-based solutions goals. You want to protect habitat. You want small, medium enterprise. You want to mine. You want a pipeline. So on and so forth. And so it becomes very difficult. You want energy infrastructure. And so that's where the frictions are, in my view. Is we have a system that typically really does project permitting, project by project. That's how it works at its core, and that's not going to work. And so you're putting communities in this really difficult position. It's not the mining company per se that's doing it, it's the system. And so that's, to me, the problem, right? And then where have I seen like the other side of that, where you see kind of acceleration for social license? It's where I view it, it's often where a couple examples where the communities are well organized. They have a sense of what they want. They're strong in their negotiation capacity. They understand the implications, and that in some ways that may be counterintuitive. Like, oh, you want your community better organized with more resources and more experts, but those are communities that can actually do deals and make agreements. And so, to me, that's where we need to concentrate, is building that capacity. I also think it's fair to say that I see the most opportunity for change amongst companies when there's a moment where something's happened, even if the company itself has a generally good position in kind of sustainability, CSR, something happens and the China breaks. And so people were like, that was a bad, and it raises to the CEO level, right? And so you see companies do things that are really interesting when that happens. And I think that's where from where I sit, I look for where are those companies that are ready to really accelerate themselves? And those are great partners for my NGO, but also for Regeneration.
Thank you, Stephen. Another question, and actually maybe just leaning into what you were saying from the organization of communities, etc., but then also, as you mentioned in your introduction, that pressure that can be pushed perhaps upstream or on different parties from the brand value of, say, a tech company or someone who then makes use of those materials downstream. Would you be able to just expand on that a little bit, please?
Yeah, I mean, like when I started doing this work and I really didn't know a whole lot about the mining industry, like it was clear to me that the risk, like how do you get a mining company to pay attention was the question. Like why would they answer the phone, right? And so if the companies who use the materials can understand the risk they have on their supply chains and in their products, then a light bulb goes off, right? And so it's almost like you have to create the idea of how bad it could get reputationally to motivate action. Blood Diamonds saw the industry, or at least part of it, in response to that. Gold companies, it was a little bit of that, but it was really, there was an opportunity that I had in that we had to engage directly with mining. There were a few really interesting mining, well, first jewelry and then mining leaders who were ready for that conversation. And so that was a kind of different and a good engagement. The issue, like I had, working with technology companies, that came later, because in the early days they were like, we don't have a problem with metals in our supply chain. We've got problems around our factories, but we don't have a problem with metals in our supply chain. Yeah, just wait a few years, and I think we'll be talking again. And lo and behold, the opportunity, when it started to become clear that the issue of critical minerals from Central Africa was going to kind of escalate as an issue. I remember sessions where we projected what that future could look like. This is in like 2007, 8-ish. There was a few companies paid attention. And those companies, downstream companies, acted, and they built partnerships with the industry, with their supply chains, smelters, to understand the landscape and take action. So I think it's a critical factor to me, along with, if you can get ESG investors to align, and I still use that phrase, I think it's just, the critique of it is a temporary phenomena. It will sustain itself. And if you can get downstream companies who care to align, and you can get a few upstream leaders, you can actually do some pretty interesting things. Sarah.
So with that, Stephen, thank you so much. Absolutely brilliant to have you with us here today. Another round of applause, everybody, for Stephen Despacito. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Excellent. Okay, so our next fantastic speaker, as I just remove all the spotlights and pass us all over, we're going to welcome the fantastic Doris to the stage. Now, I know that Aileen will be sharing the slides, but Doris, if you want to hit that unmute button, and I will start recording as well here. So Doris, we're going to get your slides up and running for you. We are almost there at the moment. I will spotlight you for everybody so we can feature yourself against your wonderful slides. Everybody, please put your hands together for the fantastic Doris Hiam Galvez. Thank you very much. Doris, over to you.
Thank you, Sarah, for having me here today. I believe that we can create prosperity while protecting the environment and improving the quality of life of local communities. Today, I will share a vision, one where the extractive industry becomes a catalyst for vibrant, thriving regions. This vision is encapsulated in designing sustainable prosperity, a method and process that enables the creation of resilient and sustainable regions. Next slide, please. The risks facing resource-rich regions include climate change, reliance on a commodity economy, and shortage of skilled labor. DSP, which we will say DSP from now on, which is Designing Sustainable Prosperity, tackles these challenges with a holistic approach, unlocking untapped potential for system-wide solution that addresses climate change. It pioneers innovative solutions to diversify and scale the economy, positioning the region as leaders in the knowledge economy. Once the focus is identified, the education system is adapted to provide skills for sustainable prosperity. Next slide, please. As shown in this slide, a regional economic activity is plotted on the vertical axis and time on the horizontal axis. The red curve represents the economic vulnerability of these resource-rich regions. It shows an increase in economic activity during operations, followed by a decline as resources are depleted. The yellow curve illustrates how the support industries follow a similar trend. The preferred outcome is, of course, shown in the green curve, is to sustain a stable, livable level of economic activity that extends beyond the life of extractive operation. This represents a big shift from a mining-centric mindset to one focus on regional prosperity. Next, please. This is the way it would look on a major copper mining project. DSP is shown in the green curve, in the green color. So implementing DSP early is ideal, although it's beneficial at any stage. Starting DSP before a project kicks off allows for a deep understanding of the ecosystem, engaging with key parties to recognize the full spectrum of possible opportunities, setting a sustainable foundation for all future projects. This approach not only helps the project flow smoothly, but enhances its reception, creating a welcoming environment for further investment. Early DSP adoption can speed up permitting processes, shortening the overall project timeline. As you can see in this image, DSP begins before the project starts and evolves through the project lifecycle. It expands during the operations phase and continues to drive prosperity after the mine's life has ended. Investors are crucial in this process, acting as catalysts for regional prosperity. Next slide, please. How to do it? It is a facilitated process of co-creation by key parties, focusing first on identifying the hidden human and natural resources potential, the essence of the region. Next, craft solutions that will form the pillars of the future economy based on the potential of natural resources, along with water and energy needs, but also outline the necessary infrastructure needs and devise solutions for repurposing waste if waste is generated. The result, attractive investment packages, including business cases and roadmaps. Next, please. Integrated natural resource models are built, layering subsurface with geoscience, surface, and climate potential to visualize the hidden potential of the region, using geoscience to figure out how the earth was formed in the region, to identify new sources for water, energy, storage options, and even soil quality. Key is understanding the whole water cycle. Next, please. A facilitated process designed to unlock the full of both human and natural resources potential, to co-create system solutions for the region. The journey follows 7 steps. The first 2 steps focus on preparing and empowering the team so that they are open to collaborate and ready to embark in this journey. When the team is fully prepared, can only move into the planning phase. So the first step is ignite the human potential. The team breaks free of limitation and is open to collaborate. And they take this ability to the second step to expand the transformation to the entire region and dream a bold vision for the region. A breakthrough occurs in the third step. After reviewing the facts, the team realizes that these dreams are achievable. It is during this step that the most creative ideas come to light, and then only can move to the fourth step to create solutions ideally suited to the region to compete in the world market. After prioritizing the business cases using UN SDG indicators, the preferred path for maximum impact is selected. Then adapt the education system to provide the skills and tools to support the evolving economy. And finally, actions to create an environment to maintain the momentum and foster a culture of innovation and creative possibility. Next slide, please. What's unique with ESG? Integrates all disciplines, has a scientific and societal transformation aspect. It is an experience. Key parties co-create the future for the region. Geoscience is key, focuses the knowledge economy, and is compliant with all UN SDGs. Next, please. Let's look at a couple of high-level case studies. Peru's south economy is driven by copper mining. Next slide, please. This region suffers from water scarcity. It has the world's highest levels of solar irradiance, as you've shown here. It also has geothermal potential. You can see a volcano to the right. This region also has good expertise in complex processes from the nearby smelters. So they can move from just being technology purchasers to leaders by showcasing their ability to adapt and evolve complex process technologies. One opportunity is advancing the direct solar seawater desalination technology by concentrated solar power, CSP. It's a complex thermal process, and this technology could be combined with geothermal energy to heat a dome structure to boil seawater, to evaporate and condense it as fresh water, a big, giant kettle. To lower the cost of this technology, high temperature processing and equipment know-how is needed. Peru can adapt these complex processes to the region, make them economically viable, and become a center of excellence for this know-how. This approach addresses the water scarcity, opening the door for precision agriculture and value-added food products. Next slide, please. In Canada's Northern Ontario Ring of Fire, a crucial ecosystem thrives above mineral deposits. Canada's peatlands encompass nearly half of the world's wetlands. They play a role in retaining water, sequestering around 60% of Canada's organic carbon in soils, mitigating flood, purifying water, and providing vital wildlife habitats. Peat soil can hold up to 30 times its weight in water. These peatlands store 3 times more carbon than a boreal or tropical forest for the same surface area. The main challenge is to maintain the environmental benefits of the peatlands, retaining the carbon sink features. So peatland regeneration becomes an opportunity for this region. It may be possible to develop a mining economy with minimum impact to the environment in this region, but develop a business case to keep the peatlands healthy. This region can be a hub for the knowledge of peatland hydrology, essential for peat stability and regenerate these vital ecosystems. Collaboration among key parties can turn this region into a hub for peatland hydrology knowledge and climate impact. we have an opportunity to redefine our relationship with nature and create solutions for balanced development. And I invite you to imagine what is possible. Next slide, please. I won't just leave you with a vision. I'll provide you with the tools and insights you need to turn those visions into reality in a book that will be published in July. I encourage you to ask questions, challenge the status quo, and be the driving force for change. The future is in our hands, and together we can make it brighter. Next slide, please. Thank you.
Doris, thank you so much for an absolutely fantastic conversation and sharing of what it is that you've been working on recently. With regards to all of this, and this comes from, I know that a number of the attendees that we have online were listening into the UN conference that took place last week, where, of course, we try to bring together a number of the different sources of value that might be in the ground beneath our feet. And I loved your diagram where you had that 3D cross-section through the earth, where you had everything from the water, and you mentioned the soil, etc. Do you see some of what you've just been describing being supported or in part encapsulated in some of those policy level models, or do you think that they're not quite capturing it yet? What are your thoughts?
I think one issue we have today is our silo way of approaching things, all the way from policies to mining companies. We are all organized in silos. Or we just do water, or we just do energy, or we just do environmental, and so on. And therefore, policies are also defined by, we'll give grants to build a solution for transport, for example. So in DSP, we are advocating a systems approach. So that the very onset, to figure out what's the real potential of the region and human potential, to figure out all the spectrum of possible opportunities. And that creates, baseline for projects to be also developed with sustainable principles. So it's a different, so this requires different way of thinking. And that's the reason, you can have the greatest ideas and greatest technologies, but nothing happens if people aren't open and willing to. And that's the reason this method has the scientific approach, the facts, and the societal transformation. We need to think differently in order to, and we have our teacher, nature, it's the nature to make this planet stable in the first place. How is it being done? That's to establish a relationship with nature and learn from it rather than trying to break the balance.
Absolutely. And I mean, maybe, Doris, is there anything from Stephen's talk that he obviously gave only moments ago, where he was talking about some of that value in going back into those brownfield sites and trying to extract value from, say, tailings facilities, etc. How does that weave into your model?
I believe we shouldn't be making any more tailings because there are technologies that can, I believe that actually we shouldn't be extracting anything from the ground, but treat it where it is with innovative ways, so that geoscience, a process, is the future. That's for the future, but we have a legacy to deal with. And Steve is doing a super job in doing that. It's complementary because, as I said, DSP is better to do at the onset, but any time is beneficial. So it could be, it will be like a brownfield asset. So what's possible, but not just look as a tailing facility, as a region. what's possible, what's the human potential, what else is around there, what's possible, and then the tailing solution becomes a component of the system, amongst other things. And I believe if you look at things this way, it's a greater acceptance, because you move from being detailing the project or the mining project into the region. And because the region benefits all, everyone works together for the benefit of the region, there should be less conflict, more acceptance, and so on, but as a system. So it's complementary, of course.
And so, and I love, and I very much agree with you in terms of that, viewing everything as that interconnected system. In terms of kickstarting all of this, and we've already been hearing a little bit about this today, in terms of kickstarting it, who pays, or where are those initial mechanisms to get this whirring away nicely?
The easiest way is probably the main investor, because many of these extractive industry are in rural or semi-rural regions, and they could be one investor, a mining company usually. So the easiest probably, they can at least do the planning study. They can finance the planning study themselves plus the utility company or any other investor with vested interest in the future of the region. Because the planning doesn't cost much, but it goes a long way in getting accepted, having less conflict, because you are no longer the target. There is the regional prosperity becomes the main target, and you become a component of the system. So even our image, from being hated no matter what we do, to be loved because we become a force to benefit everyone. So I believe an easy way is that one, but any entity, any investor, energy supplier, or the government, or academia. Another easy way is philanthropy linked with academia, for example, because it's also, DSP is a way to build an ecosystem of innovation with a market and a source. So that there's a focus for startups, there's a market, so it's based on facts rather than just invent anything, develop your startup, and try to find the market that usually never opens. and survive. So thrive instead of surviving.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Doris, thank you so much. Thank you not only for sharing your glorious diagrams, but also everything that you're building at the moment. Good luck with the book. We will be posting that link lots throughout the course of this week. Everybody, please put your hands together for fantastic Doris. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sarah.
Absolutely excellent. Cool. So what we're going to go on to now is we're going to welcome the fantastic Terry to the screen now. Terry, I know that you have 2 slides that you would like to share. So if you want to find them now, Terry and myself, as I mentioned earlier on, we met talking about artisanal and small scale mining a number of months ago, and it was absolutely fantastic. And I learned so much from the fabulous Terry. But Terry, I don't know if you're looking for those slides or if you're going to hang fire as to when you want to share them, because I will keep talking until you wave at me and tell you that you are good. He's looking for them at the moment.
Let me see if I can share.
There we go.
From the beginning. Oh, going too far. Sorry.
It's okay. There we go. Absolutely perfect. So with regards to this, everybody, please put your hands together for the fantastic Terry Gard.
Okay, thank you. I just don't want to share them immediately. Let me just come back to stop sharing for the moment. And anyway, we've seen that they are working, and that's what's important. So my name's Terry Gard. I grew up in Zimbabwe and studied mining engineering in South Africa, went back and worked in the industry there for a few decades after independence, and hung in there in the mining industry. And then eventually found that there was a new phenomenon occurring in Zimbabwe, which has now come to be known as artisanal mining. But in those days, it really was just called something like riverbed mining. And it became something that was of interest to the mining companies, but it didn't take off or didn't explode in the way it has now, and throughout the whole world. But I started to be interested in the folk who were doing artisanal mining, particularly on the chrome side, because I headed up a big chrome mining and smelting company at one point, the third largest in Zimbabwe, and then that's when I got really interested on the chrome artisanal mining side and learning what was going on and things. So that's was a seed interest into what then I went all the way through and eventually did a PhD in looking at artisanal mining, particularly gold mining in Kenya. So I've had an opportunity to really think through what artisanal gold mining is all about. And so my little talk is based on the three words that have been given to us: resilience, responsibility, and risk in artisanal gold mining. Each of these three words is invariably interpreted differently by the various stakeholders, or in the words of this conference, beholders, who are involved in artisanal gold mining. I note three groups of beholders, as firstly the miners themselves, secondly the accountable authorities, and thirdly campaigners or outside agencies such as myself who are involved in the sector. The last group are neither miners nor any of the state actors who are accountable within their country for the impacts of artisanal gold mining. There is a fourth group, a sort of dark side, and I'll come back to them later on in the talk. But the three I'm talking about are those that are above the line and who have a possible impact in change. Despite their differences, the differences in our roles, in our approaches, and in the way we understand resilience, responsibility, and risk, we have a common desire for change, for improving the situation, for developing the sector. From my experience, I've noticed two approaches to changes in mining. One is for organizational behavior, and the other is for personal change. Regarding organizations or institutions, they often start with a new policy or new principles that are established, or even a proclamation. For example, Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. These are usually followed by a second step, the issuing of procedures, laws, regulations, standards, and so on, to take such declarations of intent towards reality. Thirdly, operating procedures, safe practices, and the like are written into competency manuals or handbooks and taught in classrooms, training centers, mock mines, or actually on the job. Then fourthly, following the old adage that what gets measured gets done, what does not get measured does not get done, efforts towards implementing the standards are typically audited, inspected, or compliance is measured in some way or another, often by an outside party. All of this, it is hoped, will lead to a change in the culture of an organization or institution. And I witnessed this when I was the general manager of a large mine in Zimbabwe, and we set out to improve our health, safety, and environmental record. It took a few years, but after we worked through an approach exactly as I've outlined, the changes became part of our organizational culture. That's the sort of top-down approach. But then looking at the personal side of things, and artisanal mining is very much about individuals. Even Ludovine mentioned earlier the gold panna in a river. And so personal behavior, unlike organizational behavior, is a very real emphasis in artisanal mining. It's something that must be done in order to change behavior. It's not just about the organization at all. It really is the individual is very important in this situation. And an example of this is laid out in a book called The Wheel of Change, a model for personal transformation by Robert Gass. This model starts with motivation within the heart or mind of the individual and is followed by change in the behavior, habits, or choices we make. The third change is similar to the step above and requires education or training, even if self-taught, in the new competencies, skills, and talents required to turn one's vision, dreams, or hopes into practice. Finally, there needs to be a structural change in our environment out there, in our external life, that will allow us the opportunity to realize our personal transformation. Otherwise, it is simply not sustainable. These three areas of change in our heart, mind, in our new behaviors, and in the environment need to reinforce each other, hence the name, the Wheel of Change. Without them working in tandem, personal change is likely to falter or become unsustainable. As I mentioned, there are, broadly speaking, three groups of people who are the beholders of risk, responsibility, and resilience in artisanal gold mining. I am in one group, the outsider, with no power to create large-scale organizational or structural change, but I can still be an agent of small, low-risk changes. And there is a device, a piece of equipment that I've been involved with for a number of years called a gold catcher, which is a spinning concentrator that replaces the drudgery and dirty work of sluicing, which is part of artisanal gold mining. I was instrumental in getting the first one into the Busia gold region of eastern Uganda, and the device, manufactured by a company in Johannesburg, has sold well throughout Africa, especially in places like Ghana. There, test work has shown it to be efficient in gold recoveries. It reduces the subsequent use of mercury in extracting gold particles and saves labor. It is, however, quite a large piece of equipment. It requires a high tonnage throughput and a large quantity of water, even if that water is recycled from a nearby reservoir. But now this company, APT, have developed a mini gold catcher, and I'm now going to see if I can go back to my slide and show it to you along with other pieces of equipment. So let me see if I can now share screen, if I can find this. And let's go on to this slide here. And we'll go from the beginning. There we are. So here is a picture of one of my friends and the developer of this equipment. And it's brand new. It's just arrived in Harare last week. And there you can see the gold catcher in the middle of the picture, the orange cylindrical device. To the left, in my picture at least, there is this crusher. It's called an impactor. It's to break the rock from underground into smaller pieces. And then from there, it gets fed into the gold catcher, which you can see through the yellow tube. And then, although it hasn't been assembled properly, that then feeds into the sluice that you can see here. This is a sluice box. And the whole system is integrated and designed to work together. And as you can see, I mean, who can see mining equipment, which is usually huge pieces of equipment that are vast consumers of energy? And here you can have a person to give you a sense of scale as to how small this equipment really is and how appropriate it is for individual miners. Let me go to the final slide. And what's really exciting for me is that all this equipment that you've seen in the previous slide, along with a generator and a pump, can all be fitted onto the back of a trailer and towed to a mining site. And at last, I can see the right kind of level of appropriate equipment being manufactured for artisanal miners, allowing them to move in the first steps towards a mercury-free processing, which is this is designed to go mercury-free, to make it robust, to make it appropriate, and to make it affordable. That's very important. Miners do not like risk at all. And so for them, let me stop sharing now. For them, anything that reduces risk is absolutely critical. And that's part of the title of our conversation this week. So all the equipment can then be moved to demonstrate the system to miners, and hopefully within the next 2 weeks, we'll be moving the equipment around Harare to mining sites. We hope then that either groups of miners or other local enterprises will buy the system for their own use, or to hire it out. By paying to hire the service, such a system reduces the risks to the miners of purchasing and owning the equipment for themselves. And if I can get the right people involved, and we're busy working towards this, being mobile will allow us to promote personal practices with the miners, health and safety practices, environmental protection practices, such as the not using mercury. And once we've got further credibility as being the kind of the good guys in the situation, we hope they'll allow us underground and help them with the safety of underground mining and help the whole thing to become a bit more sustainable. Now, what interests me and why I'm keen on this is that all this, I think, is sustainable without major restructuring of the environment. We can work with this wheel of change approach. We can stimulate motivation by demonstrating valid alternatives in mining and processing to miners, for whom seeing is believing. Once motivated, the miners themselves, we hope, will want to be trained to become more competent in the use of these methods and equipment. Hopefully, if truly appropriate, they will want to own and operate the technology for themselves. And this is a very sustainable step towards responsible mining. But what would really help is that, as well as learning new competencies, the miners get faith in a bigger picture. A faith beyond being simply caught up in their hand-to-mouth existence. And this is where the dark side comes in now, beyond being caught up in a world of illegality, of crime, of corruption, a culture that so often surrounds them. And without seeing change in their livelihood environment, it's hard to promote responsible mining that will truly transform their world. And so therefore, it's up to those stakeholders who can change the operating structure, the environmental culture, to do so, along the lines that I've proposed above in terms of principles, standards, measures, and getting things done. Here is where changing structures in their environment can help. And there's a number of NGOs, there's a number of government departments that are trying to help with formalization, to help with markets, to help with financing, to enable gender, labor, and human rights. And so what I would really hope is that the two approaches can meet. The bottom-up approach, and I represent Paul Collier's The Bottom Billions in this talk and with what I'm trying to do, and the top-down approach, that is the one that most people talk about, especially at a conference like this. But changes towards resilience, towards responsible mining, and towards de-risking the consequences can be implemented in artisanal gold mining, even though the meaning of these words may not be commonly understood, as Ludovine pointed out earlier. I'm not worried, because seeing is believing. Having this kind of equipment on show to the eyes of the beholders, allowing them to see the possibilities for themselves, is the gateway to sustainable change. So, thanks very much for allowing me to share these thoughts this afternoon, Sarah.
Absolute pleasure, Terry. Thank you so much. And round of applause from all of us here who've been very much enjoying listening to you. Terry, we've got time for a couple of questions. And the first one has come in the chat. And the question is, from your experience, how affordable is this equipment to artisanal and small scale miners? In other words, how much?
Okay. So the equipment as it stands now, including the trailer, would be about $5,000 US. That is tiny in mining terms, proper mining, a real mining, large scale mining, medium scale mining. It's tiny. But for an artisanal miner, that's still quite a lot of money. However, I know that they themselves are already buying pumps, they're buying compressors, they're buying jackhammers, they're buying hoists, they're putting in rope-assisted hoists for pulling sacks out of the ground, they're putting in vertical shafts with hoists. And so that level of money is quite high compared to the gold panna that we were talking about earlier. But it's not a lot of money for hard rock mining cooperatives and other groups of miners. And that's why I do believe now that we're getting down to the level where we are making things affordable.
And Terry, in terms of the, I guess, the development of the gold catcher and getting everything off the ground, we've got a question here asking, where did that seed capital, where did that funding come from? Was it yourselves just going, hang on a second, this is something that we can do to contribute to the management of this risk, or where did that come from?
So the initial money's all come out of charity. So I've been a very busy man appealing for funds here and there, wherever I can find it. So that's part of it. The development of the mini gold catcher came really by me putting pressure on the company APT in Johannesburg, having brought the first one into East Africa. That was all charity money raised through NGOs who are involved in the sector. And so, but when they, because of me being incessantly putting pressure on them for 10 years, saying, come on, guys, I'm sure you can make a smaller version. I'm sure you can make a smaller version. They put in their own money as a company to develop the smaller mini gold catcher. And of course, they're waiting with bated breath now to see whether or not my hopes of more sales will be realized.
Well, we hope so. And final question before we move on to our next speaker. And again, it's another money one. So people are very interested in this from a financial perspective, Terry. And this again comes in from the chat of, do you have a pathway to move from charity to that more impact investment? Or could you do with any connections into impact investment?
I would certainly do with more links into impact investment. I have had a couple of conversations with impact investors in Canada and in Britain, but I haven't really been able to seal any of the deals. Right now, they're waiting for me to produce some cash flows, and so I'm busy working with other people, putting spreadsheets together to show that we can generate positive cash flows. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much, Terry. And there are some more questions and comments coming in the chat, but I'm sure we can leave you to maybe address some of those. Everyone, please put your hands together for the fabulous Terry. Round of applause.
Thank you.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Terry. Excellent. So now what we're going to do is we're going to stick with that world of finance, and we're going to welcome to the stage the fantastic Jodie Ann, who has jumped into the breach at the last moment, because before this morning, Jodie Ann, you didn't know that you'd be speaking today, did you? So this is something where thank you so much for coming and joining us. We met last week at the UN event, and Jodie is going to give a similar speech, I'm sure, as to what she gave last week. Jodie, if you need to share your slides, please do feel free to do that now. Jodie is in London School of Economics in the Grantham Institute, and is going to focus on financing a just transition in the extractive sector, really looking at that financial aspect and different types of finance that we can potentially get our hands on. So there's a nice little link there between some of those questions that you were asking Terry coming into what Jodie Ann is now going to speak about. So with that, everybody, please put your hands together for the fabulous Jodie Ann Wong. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sarah. And let me just check that you can see the full screen of my
So
slides.
we're not seeing the full screen at the moment. We are still seeing your the raw PowerPoint for some reason. But it's okay. You can see that she's got a presentation, everybody.
Perfect. Maybe I'll just make it a bit bigger.
If that's all we can see, that's fine. It's okay. We can make do with that. Cool. Yeah, that'll do. Brilliant. So everybody, we'll start again. Please put your hands together for the one, the only Jodie Ann Wong. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sarah. And hi, everyone. As introduced, I work at the Grantham Research Institute, where I work on sustainable finance and just transition. And lately, we've been looking more at the extractive sector. And I'm also part of the expert group of resource management under the UN Economic Commission for Europe. And within that, there is 2 working groups I'm a part of. One is looking at the commercial application of the UN's framework classification for resources, as well as another working group that looks specifically at the intergenerational equity lens of this issue. And what I want to show you today over the next 15 minutes is 1, what does a just transition look like in the extractive sector? And 2, what is the role of finance then in making all of this happen? But before that, I think it's helpful for everyone for us to dwell a moment on exactly what we're talking about when we say the word just transition. It originated in the trade union movements, and in 2015, we saw it being included in the Paris Agreement. And then more recently, last year at COP28, there was the operationalization of something called the Work Program on Just Transition Pathways, which then essentially what it does is help bring and help really encourage the embedding of just transition considerations across various works that's been done under the UNFCCC negotiation process. And at the Grantham Research Institute, we've been looking at this issue of just transition and finance for the past 5 years or so. And how we define the just transition is that it actually includes 3 key facets. One is that we need to anticipate, assess, and address the risks of the just transition to the low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. But 2, we also need to identify and anticipate the opportunities that the transition can bring. And thirdly, we need to ensure that there's meaningful dialogues and participation for impacted groups. That could be workers, suppliers, communities, consumers, as you see on the screen, but also knowing that in different geographies, in different instances, that stakeholder group and the weighting of each could be different. In terms of this, applying this in the extractive sector, we need to look at both the transitioning out element, that is transitioning out of coal, and the transitioning in element, which is transitioning into energy transition minerals. Both process carry certain risks to it. When we're thinking about coal and the transitioning out of fossil fuels, we know that a lot of workers stand to lose their jobs as part of this process, and they're always not the ones that stand to gain the most if we don't consider them in the deliberate planning process. And similarly, with the transitioning in, that can bring a lot of economic opportunities, but there's also risks with land grab, livelihoods being threatened, loss of sacred land, and also agriculturally productive land, ecosystem and habitat destruction as another example. So we really need to be careful about what this quote unquote green rush to renewables can bring, both in terms of the opportunities and the risks. And ultimately, you see the word system transformation on the screen, and that's something that we're trying to build into the just transition discourse as well. Because at the end of the day, we also need to question the fundamental restructuring that the systems currently need to undo some of the harms that's been going on with the social inequality and the climate crisis. So things like, are we rethinking our production and consumption and growth plans that currently have transgressed 6 out of the 9 planetary boundaries? You know, the fossil fuel-based energy system and moving towards a cleaner alternative, unfair international trade relationships that often lock in resource-rich global South countries at the basic level of the value chain, a lack of dignified jobs across various systems, and the inability, after all, to share prosperity across different systems. So that is the just transition. But if we take another step back, what is the just, quote unquote, or justice element of the just transition? You know, especially in the context of the extractive sector, it comes from a darker history of, colonial contests that require us to not only take a more critical approach at looking at the mechanisms of extraction itself, but also what does justice look like then in reconciling and repairing some of the harms that's been done for centuries. And there are 3 main types of justice that we conceptualize. The first one is distributive justice. Are the impacts and opportunities with a transition affecting different groups similarly? Or are there specific groups that are receiving more harms than others? And there's an example of the overrepresentation of toxic waste sites in communities of color, especially in the United States. There's also the question of procedural justice. Is everybody who needs to be at the table in the decision-making process there? And if not, what does that absence mean in terms of equity outcomes? And the lastly is around recognitional justice. There are different cultural norms and there are different relationships to land, especially when it comes to extractors. Are we taking those into account? Are we recognizing them and learning more about them in this process, especially when it comes to engaging with stakeholders? And each of the three justice that you see on the screen quite nicely linked to the three key facets of the just transition that I mentioned earlier. So that's opportunities, risks, and engaging with stakeholders. Now, with all of that understood and clarified, this table here helps us visualize then what does a just transition look like in the extractive sector. We map each of the three key facets against the stakeholder groups, which I've identified here as workers, communities, local economy, and future generations. And if you look at the table in the middle section, what it tells us is that the intersection of each of the key facets and each of the stakeholder group, meaning that we need to take into account every facet for every single stakeholder group. Let's take the example of the top row here, opportunities. For workers, prioritizing stable, decent jobs for the local workforce can be one way of maximizing that opportunities. Existing models like a fly-in, fly-out logic sometimes don't work and can generate mistrust and opposition from the local communities who see that as a threat to local employment. And it also kind of restrains some of the positive spillovers that can happen for local communities. Also, secondly, then if you look one cell to the right, for communities, this can look like mechanisms that enhance that local community or indigenous co-ownership of mines. There's been examples of this being done in Kenya, where indigenous Maasai custodians negotiated 5% of a local wind farm, and that proceeds would then go into a community trust. For local economy, I think in-country value addition gives a really clear example of how we can bring more socioeconomic opportunities to the local economy. So policy measures like fostering backward and forward linkages with other sectors, local content requirements that would support local SMEs in the procurement process, and long-term financing are all mechanisms that can help maximize the opportunities for local economies. And lastly, for future generations, I think Norway's Future Generational Fund is an interesting example where proceeds from extractive of these resources are reinvested into a low-cost index tracking sustainability funds, and the venue of that is then distributed as a dividend to all citizens. And it starts to beg the question of how are we redefining the terms of asset and capital and revenue and returns. Now, it's a shame I can't do full screen because I had a nice little animation across this, but it still does the job. Now that we have a clear picture of what the just transition looks like in the sector, what is the role of investors and what is the role of financial institutions? We're taking investors as an example, and this is a framework that we're proposing in a forthcoming report at the Grantham Research Institute. Mainly, we see investors having two main tools, dialogue and capital allocation. And by dialogue, we really mean dialogue with companies and dialogue with policymakers. Depending on who you want to influence, whether that's national and subnational governments, state-owned enterprises, or companies, the way that those leverage points are pulled can be quite different. So for governments, dialogues can be policy advocacy and advocating for policies that are aligned with the just transition through sovereign engagement. Capital allocation could look like incorporating just transition considerations in decision-making on sovereign or sub-sovereign bonds. And for state-owned enterprises, dialogues could happen during bond roadshows or broader sovereign engagement processes, and capital allocation can be done through SOE bond purchasing. And for companies, that may look a bit different, engagement processes, resolutions, voting during annual general meetings, and capital allocation through equity share purchasing, as well as corporate bonds. But also importantly, we need to mention that between government, state-owned enterprises, and companies, they also have an influence loop as well. Investors can then advocate, for example, governments to control SOE standards of operation and hold them to the highest standards, both in terms of human rights and labor standards, reducing environmental impacts, requiring community consultation and consent. When it comes to regulating corporate activities, that can look like tightening and enforcing standards on mining companies within territories, as well as companies headquartered domestically that operate abroad. Think of Canada as an example, where 75% of global mining companies are headquartered. Is that a key lever that can pull to maximize impact in terms of standardization and companies' activities. And that can also look like demand management. You know, any mine, however responsibly managed, will have ecological impact to an extent. The European Environment Bureau has recommended the EU set a 65% material footprint reduction target. And I think some of the underlying assumptions behind these targets are quite interesting. So at the end of the day, we also need to look at demand side measures, because we also can't really talk about a just transition without discussing things like circular economy principles and tackling wasteful consumerism and right to repair policies that provide consumer access as well. And all of these actions in the sphere influence would ideally contribute towards a just transition in and just transition out in this process. And more importantly, we want to emphasize that this framework itself is not linear. It's an iterative process that investors can use to develop their sector-specific just transition strategy, take lessons learned, engage with relevant actors and evaluate the outcomes, and then use in the process of refining as well. We've seen examples of this being done already. The UK Transition Plans Task Force recent outputs on the mining and metal sector provides an example of this, especially because it combines efforts from standard setters, from NGOs, from mining companies, and from investors as well. And actually, I think stewardship has been provided one of the clear examples of what investors can do in the extractive sector. There are initiatives through Climate Action 100+, Mining 2030, Advance, which all touch on investor engagement with companies. And in the context of transition planning, I think it's a really interesting case because it not only requires entities to establish a net zero commitment, a climate commitment, but also they need to set targets against scenarios and pathways, climate scenarios as well as social scenarios in the transition. And they need to have a time-bound plan of action that deliver against that target. And these plans would require the adequate costing of different implementations and social considerations, particularly on the OpEx side. And so if you look on the graph here on the right-hand side, what the Transition Plans Task Force guidance on mining metal has done is to actually explicitly asking companies to assess and disclose the impacts and dependencies of their transition plans on stakeholders, on society, on the economy. And I think if you have any questions on this, Sarah would be the perfect person to also talk more about the process of conceptualizing this guidance and what it can do for standard setting later on and how it docks into other global standards, sustainability standards and reporting. Now, I think everything I've said so far sounds quite hopeful, and I've painted a rosy picture of what, you know, the forces of the just transition and what we can do. But actual integration, if we're being realistic, still has a long way to go, particularly given that the history of the extractive sector and that it's been an instrumental part of colonization, and that's something that we cannot forget in thinking about what justice and equity look like then in the sector. So some high-level recommendations or things where we can see you know, the big picture moving that would help better integrate just transition thinking for investors in this process. One is we really need to see more clarified strategy, both around transitioning out of coal and into transition minerals. Transition planning disclosures is one of that tool. But there's also others, like, for example, developing better metrics and adoption. And that leads to the second part, which is around standards, tools, common principles, and methodologies that are useful to all stakeholders. This is a landscape that's getting busier and busier. And if we've learned anything from the ESG discussion, is that we need more interoperability and consistency and clarity when it comes to these standards and tools. And with the right with the clarity and metrics, with the clarity and strategy and methodologies, then investors can have more informed engagement with mining companies on just transition in these topics. But I think what is really important to mention here is that we can't really engage our way into a just transition, and we can't really engage our way out of an unjust transition. It's just one of the many tools that is at the disposal of investors. At the end of the day, we also need to see real capital allocation into more sustainable practices as well. And finance, at the end of the day, is a service function for households, for enterprises, for state to achieve the wider sustainability goals. And when we're reconceptualizing what justice means in the sector, I think it would be also really helpful to think about resources, especially minerals, as a form of shared inheritance, whereby governments, as the primary custodian of policies and measures that would enable how we produce and consume, also act as a trustee for the people who are both alive today and future generations, particularly when we think about procedural justice. Many of the future generations who will live with the consequences of the decisions we make today are not going to be here today to voice that opinion. So seeing this as a shared inheritance paradigm then also will allow us to manage these resources for the broader benefit of people and for generations in a much longer time scale of decision making. And at the end of the day, I think achieving a just transition in the extractive sector will really require change in both the mindset, the legal framework. We think of what fiduciary duty is, what profit is, what returns is, and the operating practices. So we can have a more justice-centered financial system that will have positive benefits, both in the extractive sector and beyond. I'll stop there and I'm happy to take any questions.
Jodie, thank you so much. Again, a fantastic talk. Round of applause from all of us. Brilliant. I think we've got time for just one question maybe. And the question came in actually quite early on during your presentation, which is good. And I've gone back and said, do you still want me to ask it? And they've said, yes, please. And this question is, so how can everything that you've been describing drive more effective and responsible partnerships between, say, countries such as the US, the EU, others, and those resource-rich countries to develop and diversify those mineral value chains? So how can this help with that relationship building?
It's a really important, it's definitely like a really, really good question, a really important question. I think I want to answer that with acknowledgement that the current global trade architecture and the global financial architecture has evolved in a way that does not necessarily take into the best interest of resource-rich developing countries. With that being said, embedding a just transition framework in this incremental change process can at least unearth some of unearth and center the interest of local communities who are part of the countries that are seeking opportunities to not only export their resources, but also have broader social and economic development processes. And we go back to the question of in-country value addition. I think through engagement processes, these need will come out and investors can better understand through their dialogues that if these are the gaps that are needed for current policy, then they can take that into their policy advocacy processes as well. But I think at the end of the day, we'll keep running into walls knowing that the architecture and the infrastructure in the system today is not necessarily compatible with that value chain thinking yet that maximize benefits for the downstream.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Jodie Ann, and thank you very much for giving your talk again. Round of applause, everybody. Absolutely brilliant. Fantastic. So what we're going to do now is we are going to welcome our final speaker for today's session. So our final speaker is the fantastic Andy Reynolds. Now, you heard a little bit from Andy earlier on when we welcomed him into our initial words with regards to today's session. We managed to get you up on the screen, Andy. I think we are all ready to go. Everybody, please put your hands together for the fantastic Andy Reynolds. Thank you very much.
Okay, hopefully I'm sharing my screen with you there and you can see it, and you can see the slides. Hello everybody, it's great to be with you. I'm joining you from Edmonton in Canada. And let me first acknowledge that this is Treaty 6 territory. It is land that has been occupied, traveled and cared for since time immemorial by indigenous peoples, including the Cree, the Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Métis, Dene, and Nakota Sioux. We've had a really interesting discussion so far today, and what many of the presenters have talked about is the system constraints on creating the better world that we want. Responsible raw materials is one of the largest and most complex challenges that mankind has ever faced, if you think about what responsibility means in all of its dimensions. And what I'd like to do today is to set us up for a panel discussion by really relating that to our motivations as individuals. You know, we have the largest, most complex problem, and yet it is exquisitely dependent on how we as individuals view the world. And anybody who has tried to bring innovation to a complex system has run up against the kind of things I'm going to be describing today. I hope they will resonate with you, and I hope that we will have some good material for a conversation. I'd love to learn what has worked for you and other perspectives and so on. I should say I'm not an expert in any of these areas. I'm not here to defend them academically. I lie somewhere between Dunning and Kruger in many of these topics, and what I'm really offering them to you is analogies or metaphors or ideas, really, to kick off a discussion. My slides are, I'm in a post PowerPoint world. My slides are on a Miro board, and at the end of the presentation, I'll share a link to the Miro board in the chat, so you can go through them in slower time and add comments and debate as you see fit. So first of all, I'm going to talk about models, but I'm not talking about practical models here. And I did look for a picture of a model on a catwalk, but none of those was really suitable. So I ended up with a NASA photograph of a model airplane. But that's simply to illustrate what we're not talking about. It's actually very hard to find pictures of abstract models. What we're talking about is especially mental models, the abstract representation in our minds of how things work. I'm greatly influenced by the author Peter Singer here, who talks about mental models as being both the way that we make sense of the world and the way that we take action in response to that sense making. And we might ask, well, why are mental models needed? Why do they even exist? And the answer, I think, is that we're only human. And the world around us is impossibly chaotic. And if we think about chaos as being a state in which nothing appears to be related to anything else, that's kind of our starting point. And we impose mental models on what we see around us for various reasons. I would argue it's probably social reasons, that we know that we need to work together in order to address the risks that this complexity creates for us. But we have to have some common idea of how one thing leads to another in order for that to be effective, in order for us to organize, to specialize, to create organizations. But I would argue that there's a deeper set of motivations here as well, and particularly relief from anxiety. I think different people will react to complexity in different ways. My reaction is if I don't understand how things work around me, I experience a sense of shame because I'm not able to contribute to managing them or mitigating their impacts. That's a very powerful emotional response within me. I don't know if others share that or if they experience things in the same way, but I think we need a sense of belonging when we're working together on problems, and having a shared model is very important in that. This shows up, I think, most prominently in the political domain, and I will try not to get too much into politics here, but the commonalities are very strong, so it may be unavoidable. Daniel Kahneman, who died recently, was very influential in this area of recognizing that our perception of the world is very material in comparison to the objective reality that lies behind it. So I'm going to be digging into that a little bit to find out more about what that really means. I think the first thing to say about mental models is that they are necessarily selective. You know, we're not superorganisms. We can't possibly understand everything all around us. And so if they're selective, then they have to have both an inside and an outside. And the inside is somehow rational. We believe that there are these relationships where one thing leads to another. And so we have to recognize that creates an outside that we're not paying any attention to, and we may be deliberately choosing not to do that. So maybe there's an example of this, which would be the right to free speech. If we have a mental model that says that it is an inalienable right to say whatever you want to anybody you want, and that's the inside of our rational zone, then on the outside are going to be things like hate speech. And we may choose to ignore that. We may choose to leave that externalized. We may choose for that to be somebody else's problem. But the point is that every model is going to have an inside and an outside. Think about this from a business model perspective. And by the way, I would see, in my mind, a business model is just a corporate mental model. So there's a lot of overlap between the two things here. But from a business model perspective, imagine a business model in which we thought it was okay to build a mine that would require perpetual water treatment, infinitely into the future. Somehow in the rational zone, that's the best thing to do. But outside of that, in the chaotic background, all kinds of bad things could happen. And so there's an externality there. I think all models have externalities, is the point that I'm trying to make there. And so I think the next dimension to think about is the time domain. So this is our Vice President of Sustainability looking to the future. He's 35 years old, by the way. I had some fun here trying to find a satirical name for a mining company. And the first 3 or 4 I tried turned out to be real mining companies. And so this was the only name I could come up with. But the point is that chaos is always approaching from the future. And there are various reasons for that. The rate at which it approaches varies. And I would argue that we are in a time when you don't need binoculars to see it coming anymore. And so there's this kind of advancing front that is infiltrating the safe boundary around the way we think about things with ideas that we thought we had externalized. And I think we're in a time when those pressures are increasing. And so our mental models and our business models are coming under pressure from a wide range of communities of interest who want them to do different things. And so it's really challenging what we thought was the simplification that we had built. I would say that inside that rational zone is probably 90% of the innovation that's taking place, particularly in an industry like mining. It is about turning the complicated into the efficient and continuing to ignore the complex. And so in this critical minerals era, I would say that the advancing wavefront of future complexity is creating enormous pressure in the industry on our mental models as well as our business models. Around this boundary is an interesting idea that I've sort of picked up on, which is this idea of the edge of chaos. So in many systems, biological systems, for instance, information systems, scientists have identified this area of kind of bounded instability in which new things emerge and can float around for quite a while before they resolve into stable phenomena or just simply disappear back into chaos. And if you think about it, this has been adopted by the business community as well. And if you think about it, this is how a lot of innovation happens. It happens outside the rational zone. And so living systems, to the extent that this has been studied in living systems, it appears that living systems inside the zone are constantly adapting their internal properties to avoid crossing this edge of chaos and landing in the chaotic zone where nobody knows how anything works. So the reason I mentioned that is that a lot of what we change makers are doing is using the edge of chaos to try and capture the externalities and push them back in. And so if you think about, for example, double materiality of ESG, where we have externalized impacts that we are now being invited to consider our role in creating these externalized impacts on others. And if you think about this from the perspective of somebody who's trying to keep their arms around the rational zone, it's kind of problematic. It's things they thought they had pushed out are coming back. And my analogy here, unfortunately, this will stick in your mind, but it's if you are a system innovator trying to put a larger wrapper around somebody else's rational boundary, you are essentially the spacesuit to the flatulent astronaut, and you are going to be about as welcome. And so we really have to think about the human dimension of externalization and recognize that when we're asking people to re-internalize things that they had externalized for their own sanity, it's a tall order. It's a very difficult ask. Models are often in conflict. In fact, I would say models are always a contested space. And the most obvious example that I know of here, and this dips a little bit into politics, but the most obvious example that I know of is the different theories around why we educate children. And so you might have a rational zone in which you say, well, children are the feedstock of the economy, and therefore they have to be prepared adequately with STEM skills and reading and writing, and the rules of that never change. And what we have to do is make them productive. That's a model. That's a model that a lot of people think of when they think of education. And it drives us to measure certain things. It drives us to take certain decisions. There are alternative models. There are models that people use to say, well, children should be equipped with an imagination for how things could be different in the future. And this is a hotly contested political space. And I don't mean to say that either model is right. What I mean to say is that all models are equally contested. And if you're trying to introduce a new one, then you are likely to be also trying to displace an old one. So the question is, how do some models come to dominate? And this is really an interesting question of power. This is how we interact as individuals. And I would argue here that there is a kind of a self-reinforcing loop. Great work by Donella Meadows in the Thinking in Systems. It really is the essential primer on systems thinking. And I'll come back to that. But she describes these self-reinforcing loops where success comes to the successful because the alternatives are starved out. And so if you think about using models as a theory of how one thing leads to another, it inevitably causes you to define organizational roles and routines. If you are successful, then all of the people in your organization will adapt their mental models to that. And then you'll get uniformity, and those people will continue to reach positions of authorities and will perpetuate the mental model. And probably the best example I know of this is economic orthodoxy. If you think about the Washington Consensus and what has happened to economic thinking, the danger of this, first of all, is it leads to the exit of mavericks. So people who think differently are starved out of the organization. That undermines diversity, which we all claim to see value in, despite the fact that we all claim to see value in alignment as well. And it leads to the atrophy of alternative models. But I would say it gets worse than that, because what it leads to is something I would call transcendence failure, which is a state in which we fail to recognize that our model is a model. And we start to conflate it with objective reality, or even to communicate it as objective reality. So I think there's a change sequence that goes on here where you shape the organization around a model. It becomes dominant. It appears to be achieving results, although I would say those are time bound. And so we start to evangelize it as if it is, comes down from the heavens on tablets of stone. The model then becomes invincible. And at that point, it ceases to be seen as a model. And when it ceases to be seen as a model, the organization ceases to be open to learning about alternative models. And so this I think is the real risk, is where, and it brings to mind the famous Mark Twain quote about what you know that just ain't so. Even worse than that, once a model becomes confused with objective truth, it starts to get baked into people's identities. And the reason this makes life so hard is that if you're asking people to change their models of how they view the world, you're asking them to change their identity. And if you've ever tried to talk somebody out of a conspiracy theory, you know how hard that can be once it appears to be part of someone's makeup. So this is a huge ask, and clearly we're not going to get anywhere on this without understanding or at least empathizing with the psychology of it. I said I would come back to Donella Meadows. She came up with this ordered sequence of leverage. So if you want to change the outcomes of a system, then here in order of potential value are the things that you can do. The reason I talked about transcendence failure earlier was because Donella Meadows gives such a good description of what the power to transcend paradigms is. In other words, the ability to recognize that what you think is reality is actually just your mental model. Just an observation here. I've been thinking about these 12 things and what passes for innovation in the mining industry, and recognizing that everything below, or rather everything above thing 5, never gets done. And I think this is partly due to transcendence failure. I think it is partly due to a confusion of models with reality that is now baked into the identity of and the self-perception of people who have been in the industry for a very long time. So this is an extremely difficult situation in which to try and make change. What I want to do to set up the conversation is just to suggest a few strategies for how we might do this. So, and I don't want to go into any detail on these because I think this is the panel discussion, and there will be others too, but mediating with civic society. So trying to form a bridge between NGOs, environmental NGOs, and the mining industry, for instance, is one potential approach to drive change. The Trojan horse approach, and I've learned so much from you, Sarah, about this, of starting with something that boards can't say no to, like risk management, and then seeing what space that can open up. Very powerful. We can influence legislation and regulation, and Terry talked a little bit about that in a very informative way. Faith-based dialogue, thinking about things like the Kellogg Innovation Network, what was that, 10, 12 years ago, that ran these faith-based dialogues that led to the Development Partner Institute. Inviting the industry to disrupt itself first. We remember some of those rather uncharitably described innovation theatre events of a few years ago. And then co-creating external objects, which is what we've tried to do in Inspire Resources, of creating a kind of a sandbox outside of the system that people can build things together and see themselves in it and simulate what that would look like in order to open minds to new models. I would say none of these has been spectacularly successful, and that we've talked about some of the impacts of that already today. I think that there are these organizational conditions. I'm a consultant, so there has to be a 2x2 matrix in this. And I think that organizations that will need both mavericks who are unconventional thinkers within the organization, and a culture in which there's a willingness to learn. And I'd say that's a very small subset of the industrial base. And I think that we're really, we talk about the problems of getting qualified people and talent in as if it's just a skills question, but really it's an organizational culture question. So there's a few ideas about where we might go with this. And really just in concluding thoughts here, where does the concept of responsible raw materials live, if not in the relationship between the inside of the box and the outside? the model that divides those two spaces is fundamental to this. And the other point here, I think, is how can business models change if mental models do not? And another quote from Peter Singer there, because I just love his work, and I could come up with plenty more. I hope that's a helpful way to start the conversation. I will put the link to the Miro board in the chat. If you want to join that, you'll need to provide your email address. I have no intention of using your contact details for anything. It's Miro that needs that. But if you do want to reach out to me, you're welcome to. And I would love to get into that discussion and see what you think.
Andy Reynolds, as always, absolutely fantastic. Everyone, please put your hands together for the fantastic Andy. Round of applause. Excellent. Now, we have got lots of lovely time for some questions, but also, as we've seen, Andy has set up a bit of a panel session for us. Before we go into there, because I know that Andy needs to paste that link into the chat, Terry, maybe bringing you into the discussion, and we've also still got Doris with us as well from our speakers earlier on. Terry, in terms of what Andy was saying just now, I think there was a link with something that you said, which was there are a number of different stakeholder groups, and I was in the external one, but I thought, hang on, what can I do with regards to this particular situation? And taking your words out of your mouth. So I stepped up and I did it. And we made this piece of kit and it's working. Does some of what Andy said, does that resonate with yourself, Terry? And then I'll come to Doris.
Absolutely. Having been in the large-scale mining sector most of my adult life, the various models that were put up are very true. The worry about change and how it may or may not happen. Models being accepted as reality. These are all very significant thoughts and often contribute, unfortunately, to resistance to change rather than allowing change. But once I left the large-scale sector and wanted to pursue how best one could help the micro scale, which is what artisanal mining really is. There's loads of room there. I mean, everybody's a maverick in the artisanal mining sector in one shape or another. And so it's wide open for change. But a word Annie didn't use now, but he used earlier on this afternoon was trust. And that is the biggest thing with artisanal mining, is establishing trust. And I think that is something that I've worked very hard at. And part of that establishing trust is coming up with technology that I think they will accept. If you don't come up with that technology, you will never gain that trust.
Absolutely, absolutely. Doris, do you have any thoughts that you would like to share? And then I will bring the wonderful Ludovine into the conversation as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been, of course, working in systems, and it requires thinking differently. We have to really become a new person, each individual, in order to get out of all these obstacles that were perhaps created externally by culture. So I work heavily on these, but I believe it's not difficult. It's just to go through the process of, the obstacles are internally driven. And when the invisible becomes visible, we can disrupt. So it's the same organization or individual based. It's not external, it's internal. And we can talk forever about this subject, but there are ways to not change a whole organization, perhaps, but we know it starts at the top with the values and vision, and that sets the tone for the organization. But I believe each individual has to break those barriers internally and therefore be able to motivate, encourage, inspire others. So in DSP, we cover a region, key vested interest in the region, and work together through this transformation first, because there's no point to go into a workshop to co-create the future with a mindset of lack or scarcity. First, they have to be empowered. They have to be on the greatest in order to be able to create something different. Otherwise, we keep doing the same thing over and over again, expect different results. That's called insanity. So we have to think differently.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And with that, Doris, do you think, and I say this with huge respect, do you think everybody has that natural inclination to think differently or break the models, or do you think actually that's down to a few people to kind of take the lead and then others go, oh, it's okay to do it, and so you get that kind of following mentality? Or do you think every single one of us, it's actually we need to step up and go, hang on a second, I know how we can change this? What do you think?
Excellent question. It's not a natural way. It doesn't happen naturally because we don't see what we don't see. We don't see the invisible. We don't see how we get stuck by ourselves. So it's a whole process that I work for the last, I have first 30 years of experience empowering teams, which I'm passionate about, to achieve extraordinary results. Now I perfected it in the last 10 years to be able to share and work with it and include in this method, because no matter what you want, nothing is going to happen if people aren't open to it, ready, ignited, and willing to run with it. And it's possible. It's just not naturally. It could happen naturally if we just to finish, we developed our program, our human intelligence based on our experience and our needs. And that keep us safe and stop us from trying different things. So once we see that, the mechanism by which we make choices and actions that take us to get stuck, we get angry because we see it and we can disrupt. And then we can do things different and upgrade our human intelligence. So it doesn't happen naturally.
So with that, and actually building on that word safe that you just used, but using it in a slightly different context. Ludivine, I promise I will come to you. But Andy, in terms of within the mining sector, we're taught quite rightly so that safety is our number one priority. And the way over the last certainly 15 years that we've all been taught to keep ourselves and one another safe is to obey rules. And so therefore perhaps not think in that innovative way or break the rules, which might be another way of interpreting breaking the model. Now, this, of course, is slightly ironic because actually some of the safest working places are where someone has thought outside the box and thought, hang on a second, how can we do this better? Do you feel, Andy, there's an element of this kind of cultural training that we've had within, say, large scale mining companies where you're taught obey the rules, but then on the other hand, you're taught be innovative? How does that come together?
Yeah, there's a very interesting chicken and egg question around adaptive behavior. Does the mining industry repel people who think differently? Is I think an interesting question, because if you're a maverick, I always thought that when I was leading large teams, I always thought that the most generous thing I could do, the most rewarding thing I could do, was to say to somebody I was leading, I've changed my thinking on this as a result of what you've said. Because I almost never had a boss who said that to me, and I felt repelled by organizations that weren't willing to listen to an alternative viewpoint. And I remember a great story from Alan Bai when he joined his platinum mining company for his first job in South Africa. And he wrote a letter to the general manager outlining a number of opportunities to improve the functioning of the business. And the general manager called him in and said, "This is very interesting. Take your letter, go and put it in the concentrator and see if you're getting more platinum out." And so, he was at that moment demotivated and repelled as an independent thinker by the organization. So I think the question is, it comes down to what's the quality of leadership and how does the leadership balance efficiency with innovation? It's how do you balance the performance engine with the innovation engine? You know, various people have written on this topic, there's various books on it, but it's a question of balance. Loon Shots is my current favorite book on this topic. How do you stop these organizations killing each other? You know, the innovative one and the excellent one. There isn't, like, either of those by itself is not future fit.
Yeah,
that's a roundabout kind of answer, but
no,
it depends.
No, this is great, Andy, and actually I think, just so that everyone's aware, so obviously this is session 1 of 8 that we have this week. Over the course of the last few talks, we've heard numerous quotes, books, papers, inspirational people to go and look up. Something that we'll be doing, and I'm looking at the team here at the moment, is collating all of this in a list and making sure that it's available as part of this year's conference page for you. So if you want to go and look up some of the individuals that Andy and Terry and Doris and everybody else have been suggesting, we'll make sure that they're all available for you. So thank you very much for that, Andy. Ludovine, I did promise that I was going to come to you as well. Do you have any thoughts, reflections on the whole afternoon, not just what Andy has just said now?
So many, my goodness. First of all, I'm a recovering lawyer, so I come from a background where we are taught the language of the system, and we are, you know, structured to create certainty from the uncertain system of humans. That's effectively what it is. So I not only understand what you're saying about the resistance to change, but can definitely echo the feelings of deep discomfort that journey entails. I think what I would perhaps throw in there is that there is a bit of a red thread that's run through this, but almost silently and invisibly. And I think that's the way they like it. Mining finance and the people who finance mining, but also other mineral operations, are quite an insular group. This is usually investors and finance, capacity that does not invest in other things. And the rest of the, financial levers and investment capacity generally don't touch mining and minerals. And I do think that this insularity and their relative separateness from other types of finance, other, asset exposure, does have something to do with a culture that doesn't foster much innovation. And I think this links to a little bit of what Doris was saying, where we need to somehow at some point subvert the conversation by giving other stakeholders a power to co-design, having understood that, for them to innovate, we also need to make sure that individually everybody has that willingness. But I do think that there's an opportunity at the moment, because we talk about risk mostly as threat, but there's an opportunity right now in the whole discussion about new financing capacity for mining and minerals. Jody Ann, I think, alluded to this with the idea that, we need to bring investors who have never touched this to embrace mining and minerals. This means that they come with their constraints as well as their perspectives. In order for that shift to happen, and let's be honest, it's not happening. I don't care about the nice big announcements. Oh, Tesla and Volkswagen did this. Their money is not coming in any significant way. There is no visible capital reallocation to mineral operations and mineral value chains that we are seeing today. I think that's an opportunity, and I think that's an opportunity to seize first of all, to understand their constraints and why they're not touching mining and minerals, but also maybe they can bring another mindset, another approach. As much as we need their money, because by the way, the financial capacity of mining is actually extremely limited. Maybe we need their mindset even more. But that means that we need to have a conversation. And I do believe policy shapers could do a better job of enabling that conversation by understanding the constraints to that investment.
Thank you, Ludovine.
So that's my general thoughts. Revolutionize mining finance.
Well, these are all thoughts and concepts that there's a reason why we invited this fantastic array of speakers to kick off this year's conference, to get us all thinking. And personally, I have lots of little kind of little bubbles in my head sort of beginning to grow and shape, and I can see them kind of melding together and beginning to form some of those thoughts. And hopefully when you look at the agenda for what we've put together for the rest of the week, you're going to see a whole load of other speakers where you think, okay, I can see why this person might be connected to that person. How do some of these ideas, how do some of these thoughts evolve? So that the big challenge for Ludovine and myself anyways, by the time we arrive at the end of our Friday session, we can roll it all together and put a nice big bow on the top of it. But just before we finish for today, Doris, I know that you've got your hand up. I will come to you first. And then what we're going to do is we're going to do a loop around our speakers who are still with us and say, okay, so as a community of interested stakeholders in this world of raw materials, which to be honest includes all 8 billion of us on this planet, because we all need raw materials in some format, what can we be doing to help you as individuals push forward your innovation and your ideas? But Doris, let's come to yourself first, and then I'm going to go to Terry.
Yeah, I was just going to make a quick comment to the previous discussion, then I can come to this. And just briefly, organization-wise, it's just permission to fail, to try new things, and live in the learning zone. That's it. And it starts from the leadership. So it's not that complicated. When we don't know the answer, it looks like the brain is designed to thrive in uncertainty, and that's when the juicy stuff comes. So anyway, now on the other side, to advance the subject I share, designing sustainable prosperity, the biggest obstacle is, again, we've always done things as we always done, and therefore we deal with things silo by silo. But so what's needed is financing to do the first step, to do the first pilot, financing. And there are many interested people in financing, but again, those are tied to specific things. You know, do an infrastructure, a road, power plant, or things like that, and not as a system approach to figure out, you know, the whole prospect of possibilities, opportunities for a region, and set the stage for the rest of the projects to be responsibly done as well.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much, Doris. Absolutely fantastic. Terry, how about yourself? And then we'll go to Andy.
Just before I go there, just a couple of things. It seems to me, and I really did like your paper, Doris, that perhaps the whole idea of sustainable prosperity needs to start right at the beginning of a mine's history. So around about the time the exploration geologists or the mineral geologists have identified the deposit and the mine feasibility study is now beginning to emerge, that's when we should be thinking about designing sustainable prosperity right at the beginning, and change the language from environmental impact assessments or social impact assessments and start to bring in the language of sustainable prosperity. So that might be, you know, an avenue in for this kind of big picture thinking right at the beginning of a mine's life. And so that could be helpful. Yeah. I
was just going to add to that, Terry, that actually, so tomorrow morning's session has a number of speakers who will 1000% agree with what you just said. So they come from that world of exploration, and where before we've even put boots on the ground and we're just looking at maps and looking at data and thinking, well, hang on a second, we're not just thinking about the potential of the rocks. We're thinking about the potential of everything else in that interconnected ecosystem. So absolutely. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Terry.
No, it's perfect. No, I'm glad that sums up nice, because I'd like to now make a quick comment also to Ludovic, and that is that mining companies' financial history, you need to go back, I'm sure you have already, a couple of 100 years, and realize that the financing models of big infrastructure projects in Britain, for example, like canals and railways, has always been much bigger than banks and banking could come up with, and tended to often come from the public. So the early years of big infrastructure projects are tied up with stocks and shares and stock markets. And the same with mining. Once mining became a colonial endeavor, money was raised in the host countries like England, and then spent in the colonial countries, the colonies. And so there's always been a resistance by the banks to invest large monies in mining. There's always been the capacity to raise money on stock exchanges for large mining things. And with that comes the inevitable, and Andy touched upon this, resistance to change. When you're mining in one country and paying back shareholders in another, it does create its own very strong constraints as to how much innovation you will allow yourself to have as a mining company. And so there's a long history of resistance to change in mining, and it goes back centuries. I think there's nothing new about that. And perhaps new models of mining, such as what Stephen was talking about earlier, may attract new models of investment. And I think that it ties in with the big picture of mining industry, and we need to support people like Stephen to expand the mining industry into words like regeneration and dealing with present mining wastes and so on. But look upon that also as an opportunity for new kinds of investment. So I thought that was a very fascinating too. Then back to myself, really, as I said in my paper, there's two angles to what we're trying to do here in artisanal mining. The one angle is the top-down approach. Anyone who has any ability to try and work with government, to try and work with local government, national government, international government, to try and change the narrative, is the favorite expression, around artisanal mining is welcome. But at the same time, don't try and lay down too much in the way of expectations from the miners themselves, unless we have an equal bottom-up approach, the one I was also arguing for in my talk. And the trouble right now is that the top-down people don't talk to the bottom-up people, and the bottom-up people don't know how to talk to the top-down people. And so there is this big gap. But the two models I talked about show where that gap overlaps. And I do hope that time will help artisanal mining to gain credibility and to become part of genuine, just transition that we were talking about as well. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Terry. Brilliant. Andy, any final words or things that we collectively can help you with or support you with? And then we'll finish with Ludovic.
Yeah, a couple of things. One, this conference has always been an early indicator of trends. And the trend that I'm seeing is people are starting to realize that the junior mining sector is in a much worse shape than the senior mining sector with regard to the challenges of responsible raw materials. And I think this has been overlooked because the junior mining sector doesn't produce. But in fact, it's where a lot of outcomes are de facto determined. And many of us, I think, are starting to realize we've got to shift to that sector, even though there's no money in it, in order to solve the problem. It is structurally broken. And I think we need to put our heads together and figure out how to do that. Certainly Inspire Resources, if you look at our website, it says that we're pivoting. That's what we're pivoting towards, is to figure out how can we enable, in this crazy atomized collection of lifestyle exploration companies. How can we enable something more effective to emerge and enable the investors and the proponents to find each other in that chaotic marketplace? So I see potential for us to collaborate on that. And that brings me to my point of what can we do? First of all, don't lose hope. So if you are in the system change sector, you are part of a very small percentage of people who see the big picture. And you carry a burden on behalf of society, which is your ability to see that. And you will never get to where you would like to go. I'm sad to say we can only contribute to moving in the right general direction. But if we withdraw ourselves from the fight, we won't do that. And it is the job of forums like this to bring us together and allow us to find the sense of community that keeps us going. One of the reasons I moved back here to Edmonton is because it has a thriving startup community. And when I started mixing amongst those optimistic entrepreneurial people, and their impossible dreams, I received succor that I didn't realize I had been missing. It was a fantastic thing. And we're going to have to do this across a very globally distributed small group of inspirational people who can see a different way to do things, and we're going to have to work together. That's why I'm here.
Awesome. Inspirational. Thank you very, very much, Andy. Ludovine, final words from yourself.
Goodness, it's quite hard. First, my final words will be to thank all of the speakers, because what they're sharing with us, as Andy was saying, is a sense that there is a great deal of opportunity and that each of us can play a role. I do think that the more we bring back to these conversations some of the tools that we work with most efficiently, the better we can actually define new solutions. What do I mean by that is I do think that the purpose and the value of governance, whether we're talking corporate governance or mineral governance, the whole notion of stewardship, whether we're talking investment stewardship or natural resources stewardship, all of these principles of fairness, of accountability, and of defining shared principles which guide action, I think all those still serve very well. So as much as innovation is the need, I do think some of the tools are already there, and it's a question of projecting them into defining either a new paradigm or new solutions or new linkages.
Thank you, Ludovine. Brilliant. So with that, everybody, in an attempt to try and encapsulate what we have heard already today, we started off today with Ludovine setting the scene and saying, okay, why on earth did we choose critical choices as being the theme of this year's conference? And as Andy said, often what gets discussed here, quite by chance, I should say, actually does help to shape some of the discussions that then seem to take place at other conferences throughout the year as well, which is absolutely brilliant. And fantastic to see. We then heard from Stephen, who was there talking about regeneration, and again, an example of rolling up your sleeves and saying, hang on a second, there is something to fix over here or an opportunity to be had. It might not be valued in the same way that we value a traditional resource, but actually let's look at that value from other directions. We then heard Doris describe her Design Sustainable Prosperity, which is absolutely brilliant. I encourage you all to go and buy her book when it comes out. I certainly shall be as well. And that integrated natural resource models, I think Doris and I will certainly be taking her discussion offline, because there's lots of synergy between diagrams that I showed last week in the UN and Doris's much more professional looking diagrams that she showed today. Absolutely brilliant. Then across to Terry, who really has stepped up and said, hang on a second, I might be an an outside stakeholder with regards to this discussion, but I've gone, hang on, I can change this little bit in that interconnected model. Let's go do it. Absolutely fantastic. Thank you, Terry. And if there's anything we can do to help in terms of financing the bits of kit or anything like that, put your links in the chat. We'll make sure they're up on the website as well. Then Jodie Ann came and joined us, and she not only showed us how some of those risks look different through the eyes of different stakeholders. Genius, that is what we mean by risk is in the eye of the beholder, but also different mechanisms that, say, investors can bring to the table. What does the world look like through their eyes? What do those systems look like through their eyes? And then we finished with Andy, who is an individual from whom, I don't know, Andy, every time I listen to you, there are more quotes that I could pluck from what you say. I think the one that has been resonating the most on chat is basically, at the end of the day, all sounds great, so long as my ideas aren't just a fart in a spacesuit, then I'd be absolutely great with regards to that as well. So thank you so much to all of you for setting the scene for this year's Responsible Raw Material Conference. A huge number of different ideas for us to go away and ponder overnight. Tomorrow morning, so session number 2, is where we're actually going to dive into that world of junior mining. We're going to jump into that world of exploration and say, hang on a second, how do we look at different models for exploration, different value propositions for exploration? What is it actually all about? And we've got some of the world leading experts when it comes to all of this. And it's not just talking about the rocks. We'll also be talking about ethics and trust as well. And then tomorrow afternoon, so session number 3, this is where we're really welcoming some of our civil society friends to come into the discussion and say, well, hang on a second, what do raw materials look like through their eyes? We've got talks that are entitled The Mine We All Want to See. So turn up and find out what that looks like. That's going to be really exciting. And then also as well, diving into the transparency of supply chains. So with that, everybody, thank you so much. Thank you. A massive thank you to our fantastic team of volunteers. We will see you tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. UK time. If that is a terrible time for you because it's the middle of the night, don't worry, you can catch up online because we're using technology and it's all going to be there on YouTube. Aren't we clever? Isn't that fantastic? But with that, please continue to engage and we'll see you all tomorrow. Thank you very much, everyone. See you soon. Cool.
Thanks, guys. Lovely to see you. Talk soon.
Yes, thanks, everyone. Thanks so much. Good day. Thank you.
Good to catch up. Nice to meet some new people.
Thank you. Wonderful
Cool.
session. Thank you.
Talk soon.
Thank you very much, everyone. Brilliant. What we'll do is after the count of 3, we will stop the Zoom session. It's not because we don't love you. It's just because we know you've got other things to go and do. So with that, Aileen, are you ready to kill the meeting?